If you ask fans today about what was the greatest period in WWE history, many will tell you that it was the Attitude Era. But there was another time which came before that, the original boom for the WWF. Hell, this was really the origin point of the company as we know it now, a sports entertainment spectacular, as so much of the rulebook that is followed today was written here. But just what made it so special? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. But before we go into detail about the Golden Era, we have to first provide some context about what the wrestling industry was like prior to this. Back in the 70s and before, in North America at least, it was divided into a number of territories, with a promoter of each of these territories running it like its own kingdom. If, for example, you went down to Memphis, then it would be all about Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association. And if you instead went over to Dallas, then you'd find Fritz von Erich's World-Class Championship Wrestling ruling the roost. Of course, that was only a tiny percentage of the major territories operating during the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Outside of them, there were also places like Championship Wrestling from Florida, Mid-South Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, the American Wrestling Association, Pacific Northwest Wrestling, Stampede Wrestling, and of course, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Hell, even over in Japan, you had official National Wrestling Alliance affiliates like Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling. But while every one of these had their own dedicated fan bases amongst the local populace, the WWF, or Worldwide Wrestling Federation to give it its full name, had one major advantage in that it was in the New York territory, so it was a very attractive one for many performers to head over to. Yes, one thing you could always count on if you did a spell in New York during this era was that you were going to be paid very well. And on top of that, you were also going to get the chance to work with big stars like Bruno Sammartino, Bob Backlund, and superstar Billy Graham. Even then though, the idea that WWF would ever be the only game in town back in the early 80s was unthinkable, as this was the point when all the promoters had a handshake agreement with one another not to encroach upon each other's space. In doing things that way, everyone could thrive in their own areas, and all the wrestlers would have a healthy system of different places they could look for work in. But there was one man who had a bigger vision for the industry, and that person would be none other than Vince McMahon Jr., the son of WWF's owner Vince McMahon Sr. What was Vince Jr.'s vision? Well, he saw the rise of cable television happening in the early 80s, and within this, an opportunity to take the sport national, creating one major promotion which would cover the entire country, and then later, the entire world. Basically, he wanted to create wrestling's version of the NFL. And that was something he set about doing in 1982 when, after a few years of having worked for his father, he purchased the promotion from him, with his dad making him a sweetheart deal where he would be able to pay him back over time in a series of installments, something which was easily done for the new boss as the New York territory regularly drew a lot of money, more so than most other territories out there. That said, while buying the company may have been pretty easy for Vince, going national was not going to be so simple. No, this required a lot more risk. So he made sure to get all his chess pieces in place over the next couple of years, as throughout the rest of 1982 and the entirety of 1983, the boss started investing in the future by signing away big names from other places, with some of the biggest of these being Roddy Piper, Bobby Heenan, and of course, Hulk Hogan. Yes, it would be in December of 1983 that the key player in the Golden Era which was to come would re-debut in the now renamed World Wrestling Federation after having spent a prior period there back during the turn of the decade. And almost instantly after reappearing, Hogan would be pushed to the moon as he was booked to win the WWF Championship from the Iron Sheik in January of 1984. Clearly then, the message was out there now. WWF was going hard with their push to be the top dog in wrestling, and the way they were doing this was by having the biggest and most colorful star there was, surrounded by a high-end production which would appeal to the children of America en masse. But this in itself wasn't seen as controversial by other promoters. No, making your own territory successful was what they were all trying to do after all. What was seen as heresy to them, however, was when, soon after this, McMahon started going into other territories and offering the local TV networks there extra money in order to give him the TV time they would be giving to places like Jim Crockett, Mid-South, and others instead. Hell, one of the most famous incidents of this, the one which saw Georgia Championship Wrestling's time slot suddenly turn into WWF's one out of the blue one day, would later come to be known as Black Saturday, and it would represent a huge line in the sand in the industry's history, a definitive before and after point. What those other promoters realized at this point, too late for them to do anything about it, was that Vince McMahon wasn't looking to just compete with them. No, he was looking to flat out end them, something which completely broke the code that territorial wrestling had been built upon up until then. So, needless to say, Vince McMahon Sr. was not happy about this when word got back to him about what his son was doing. But with him being in his final days by that time, there was little he could do to stop the inevitable future which was coming. A future which would reach its final form when, in early 1985, Vince Jr. made a deal with MTV to start airing special events on their network, the most important of which would be the War to Settle the Score on February 18th of that year, a show which was headlined by a match pitting Hulk Hogan against Roddy Piper for the WWF title. Did this do its job in garnering a bunch of interest from young people who had never sampled pro wrestling before? Yes, it did, as immediately it was clear the War to Settle the Score was something different to what had come before. Sure, the myth that pro wrestling had only existed in smoky bars prior to that is just that, a myth, as many territories had been able to fill out large arenas and even stadiums in the past, all while JCP had been pioneering the Wrestling Super Show with Starrcade as early as 1983. That said, what none of these companies had was the neon-soaked sheen and colorful, larger-than-life look that Vince McMahon was presenting. Basically, this was something which felt far more big-time for a decade like the 80s than whatever the likes of Bill Watts or Jerry Jarrett were doing. And the success of the War to Settle the Score would only be the beginning as it turned out, because just 1 month later, on March 31st, WWF would run WrestleMania, a spectacle unlike anything the industry had ever seen before. And not just because it was helmed by Hulk Hogan, the man who was fast becoming a breakout pop culture phenomenon, but also because it drew a lot more casual eyeballs in with the addition of major celebrities like Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, Liberace, and most importantly, A-Team star Mr. T. Yes, it would be Mr. T who partnered up with the Hulkster in the main event of the show to defeat the villainous threat of Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, and that proved to be a great decision as it helped to turn the show into a massive success, a true moment in 80s pop culture history, as for the first time, middle-class families all across the country were talking about professional wrestling and were even going to watch it on closed-circuit screenings at local cinemas. As you would expect then, once it was over, WWF suddenly became the talk of the town as kids in particular now became obsessed with the antics of their favorite superstars. How would this impact the larger industry? Well, while most of the other territories would keep fighting, it was clear after a show like WrestleMania that they were fighting a losing battle and that the industry had now changed dramatically. And this was something a lot of the wrestlers working for these promotions realized too, which was why a number of them decided to jump ship to WWF as well here. We're talking about names like Ted DiBiase, Jake Roberts, and Junkyard Dog leaving Mid-South, the Honky Tonk Man exiting stage right from Stampede, and perhaps most importantly, Macho Man Randy Savage taking his leave from Memphis. That's right, if Hulk Hogan was the undisputed ace of the golden era, then Randy Savage was a strong number 2, with his excellent in-ring skills and fantastic larger-than-life character proving to be a huge hit with fans as soon as he arrived in WWF in the summer of 1985. That said, during those early days, he would technically be a heel, with it being his villainous antics which were brought to the forefront as he gained control of the Intercontinental title. And he'd still be in possession of that belt by the time WrestleMania 3 came around, and he had a true Matt Classic, probably the best in-ring effort of the Golden Era, against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat here. But while Savage Steamboat might have been the best wrestling match at WrestleMania 3 by a clear distance, it wasn't the bout which drew the house. No, after WrestleMania 2 had been seen as something of a disappointment following the blow-away success of the first installment, with it largely overreaching itself by trying to air live from 3 different cities at once, the third entry in the series would do something almost unparalleled by taking pro wrestling to an all-new height. How did it do this? Well, on March 29, 1987, 78,000 people would be packed into the Pontiac Silverdome in Michigan to watch the historic showdown between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Clearly then, from a spectacle standpoint, this was the high watermark of the Golden Era, as it was an achievement the company wouldn't be able to best for years thereafter, a true sign that wrestling had entered a new stratosphere in terms of mainstream acceptance. And this would lead to WWF only continuing to grow in popularity with kids, now all across the world, as following the success of Hogan Andre, the WWF merchandise machine went into overdrive, and you couldn't walk around a playground without at every turn seeing Rowdy Roddy Piper t-shirts, Randy Savage lunchboxes, Jake Roberts school bags, or kids talking about the latest episode of the Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling Saturday morning cartoon. Truly, it's impossible to overestimate just how huge WWF was back then. It became a bona fide piece of pop culture iconography, a slice of 80s Americana on the level of Back to the Future or Michael Jackson. And the promotion would continue to grow from here, as over the next few years, they added more major shows to their calendar in the form of Survivor Series, SummerSlam, and the Royal Rumble, with the latter of these becoming particularly popular on account of it being the home of the titular 30-man over-the-top Battle Royal, arguably the greatest gimmick match ever created. Hell, so popular were Vince McMahon and company here that when Andre the Giant conspired with the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase to screw Hulk Hogan out of the WWF title at February 5th, 1988's The Main Event on NBC, a staggering 33 million people would be watching all around America. But while this shocking moment, which was seen by so many, marked the end of Hogan's first world title run in WWF, it wouldn't leave fans without a babyface champion for long, because at WrestleMania 4, a couple of months later, a newly babyface Randy Savage would win a one-night tournament to become the new top dog in WWF. And while this could have been seen as a risky move on the face of things, taking the belt off of the face of the company, the Macho Man proved to be so over, business would remain just as strong with him as the man. So over would he be, in fact, he'd keep a hold of that belt for the next year, all while Hulk Hogan took a few months off to start his burgeoning film career with a starring role in No Holds Barred. And when he returned from his sabbatical in the summer, he'd start a program with Savage which in many ways marked the creative peak of the golden era, the saga of the Mega Powers. What made the Mega Powers angle so great? Well, it saw the undisputed top two stars in Vince McMahon's promotion partner up throughout the second half of 1988. But it wasn't all good times amongst the pair. No, as the months went on, the Macho Man started growing more and more jealous of the Hulkster as he came to believe that Hogan had lust in his eyes for his on-screen valet and real-life wife, Miss Elizabeth. And that would all reach a head in early 1989 when, in a now classic scene, the Mega Powers exploded after Savage turned heel on his partner, with this causing a one-on-one match between them to be booked for WrestleMania 5, one in which the WWF title would be on the line. As you would expect then, that match ended with Hogan regaining the WWF title, and in doing so, he solidified his spot as the ace of the era and the biggest star wrestling had ever seen at that time. Honestly, while many members of the roster were full-blown household names come the late 80s, specifically people like Jake the Snake Roberts, Macho Man Randy Savage, the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, and Rowdy Roddy Piper, the Hulkster was on another level altogether, just as recognizable to many kids as Santa Claus or Mickey Mouse. That said, there was a challenger to his crown who had started rising up the ranks by this point, one who went by the name of the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, after making a quick splash in WWF following his debut in 1987, Jim Hellwig had ascended to the level of true superstardom by the close of the decade, something which was made easy for him on account of a look and physique which could basically be described as a superhero action figure come to life. So big was he by late 1989, in fact, there were questions being asked by his bosses about whether or not he was the man to take the mantle from Hulk Hogan as, by this point, the Hulkster's act was already starting to show signs of getting a little long in the tooth. So it was then that in a moment which represented another pretty big gamble, Vince McMahon decided to make the switch at WrestleMania 6 when he booked one of his biggest matches to date, a babyface versus babyface bout between the two biggest stars of the promotion. And what's more, this one would be one in which both the WWF title held by Hogan and the Intercontinental title held by Warrior would be on the line, winner take all. Of course, despite Jim Hellwig's growing popularity, most people expected the Hulkster to come out the victor here, but those people would be shocked when the show ended in Toronto that night, with the Ultimate Warrior holding both belts over his head as the new top star of the WWF. How would the other territories out there be responding to this? Well, for those who were still around by 1990, the only one that would still have any sense of strength left in them would be Jim Crockett Promotions, a company which had by then metamorphosed into World Championship Wrestling. But even WCW, the last bastion of the once mighty governing body of the industry, the National Wrestling Alliance, was nowhere near the level of popularity that the WWF was as the 90s began. And if you needed any evidence of this, you only need to look at the fact that at the turn of the decade, Dusty Rhodes, one of the pillars of JCP as both a wrestler and a booker, ended up jumping ship to WWF following a disagreement with his bosses down south. Sadly though, this popularity Vince McMahon's company was undergoing was about to hit a snag because, as the new decade got going, the first cracks in the armor of the Golden Era began to present themselves. And the first way this happened was when the new world champion turned out not to be the draw people thought he would be. No, for as over as the Ultimate Warrior had been as Intercontinental Champion, and for as much as children regularly went into excitement overdrive whenever he barreled out through the curtain, Once he was given the top prize and asked to shoulder the weight of the entire company, it quickly became clear he was not going to be a suitable replacement for Hulk Hogan. And that led to the first signs of business starting to soften since the boom period had begun. How would WWF respond to this? Well, they'd play it safe and go back to the Hulkster at the next possible opportunity. Yes, after the Warrior dropped the title to Sergeant Slaughter at the 1991 Royal Rumble, Terry Bollea would be the man to take it from the heel transitional champion at WrestleMania 7. Sadly though, this caused more problems than it fixed, as the storyline heading into Mania that year would center around Vince McMahon trying to get heat from the real-life ongoing Gulf War of the time by having Slaughter play the role of a former American military hero turned heel Iraqi sympathizer. As you would expect then, this was a step too far for many fans, and it led to the showcase of the Immortals having such poor ticket sales that year, it had to move from the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to the much smaller Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena at the last minute, a pretty big blow in terms of public perception for the promotion. But that was far from the only problem they'd be undergoing here, as general sentiment on the product started to sour following the failure of the Ultimate Warrior's run on top, and the steroid trial began to loom larger and larger. But that wasn't to say there wasn't still plenty of good stuff to be found in WWF during those latter years of the Golden Era. Hell, by this point, The Undertaker had made his debut in spectacular fashion at the 1990 Survivor Series and would even become WWF champion for the first time later in 1991. And that same year would also see another major debut, as it would be then that Ric Flair himself jumped from WCW, still in possession of the big gold belt, the one he referred to as the real world's title, and also quickly rose to the top of the promotion in short order. In fact, mere months after his debut in WWF, the Nature Boy would be winning the 1992 Royal Rumble, quite possibly the greatest Royal Rumble of all time, to become WWF champion himself. Clearly then, this marked the start of a change in the way WWF was booking the show, as only a couple of years prior it would have been unlikely that Flair would have been given the top prize because for as great as he was, he just didn't have the superhero physique which was required to be a top guy in 80s WWF. And that change in the way Vince McMahon was booking would also be seen in the initial singles pushes of former tag team mainstays like Bret Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels, two of the people who had helped to anchor that division back when it had been going through an excellent period during the late 80s with duos like the British Bulldogs, Demolition, the Brainbusters, the Road Warriors, and more. So with all these new happenings in the air then, it made WrestleMania 8 on April 5th of 1992 feel like something of a season finale in many ways, especially as, heading into the show, Hulk Hogan had announced that it might very well be his swan song to wrestling. That's right, the man who had been so critical in taking WWF to the successes it had reached during the 80s was now on the verge of exiting stage right. Why was he leaving here? Well, there were two main reasons, the first of which being the fact that by this point fans had started to tire of his act, so much so that they'd even cheered when he was eliminated at the Royal Rumble earlier that year. And then there was the second reason, the bigger reason, the steroid trial. Yes, as the biggest scandal in the company's history at the time became huge mainstream news and Vince McMahon faced a potential prison stay, Terry Bollea realized his involvement in the whole thing was making him too hot to handle as a performer. So for the sake of his long-term preservation, he decided it was best for him to step away for a while. And that would be the same for a lot of the larger-than-life performers in the WWF during the early 90s too, as it happened because throughout that year, the likes of the Ultimate Warrior, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts, Sid Justice, the British Bulldog, Sergeant Slaughter, the Legion of Doom, Greg the Hammer Valentine, and Jim the Anvil Neidhart would also disappear from TV. Hell, for these reasons then, many believe it was 1992, specifically WrestleMania 8, which officially marked the end of the Golden Era, as it was the point where, even when you take into account the fact that SummerSlam packed almost 80,000 people into Wembley Stadium later that year, business was on a definite and dramatic downswing overall. Honestly, in North America, it was the coldest the product had ever felt since Vince McMahon Jr. took over around a decade prior. But it wasn't the complete end. As well, that year did see a lot of the names who would go on to become the faces of the new generation era begin to rise to the top, specifically Razor Ramon during his debut, Shawn Michaels when he became Intercontinental Champion, and Bret Hart after going all the way to the top by dethroning then WWF Champion Ric Flair. There were still some lingering dregs of the Golden Era left hanging around. And all of this would lead to a last gasp attempt from this era to revive itself in early 1993, as by the time WrestleMania 9 came around and it became clear to the boss that business was taking a downturn with his new movement of younger, more athletic stars, the older generation would need to be pushed right to the top again. and the way that happened would anger many, as in what has since gone down as one of the more unpopular booking decisions in WWE's history. The showcase of the Immortals this year ended not with Bret Hart standing tall over his top challenger Yokozuna, and in the process cementing himself as the new face of the company. No, instead things would close out with a returning Hulk Hogan somehow back on top once again as he left the Caesars Palace parking lot as the new WWF champion. Yes, while most people were ready to let go of the golden era by then, Vince McMahon obviously wasn't, as he still saw some potential. But to be fair, he must have been extra desperate to try and squeeze what was left from the 80s boom period, as over the space of 6 short years, the promotion had gone from packing out the Silverdome to barely filling up the parking lot of a casino in Las Vegas for their biggest show of the year. That said, no matter how much the boss was desperate to keep the glory years going, by the time Hulk Hogan dropped the WWF title to Yokozuna at King of the Ring later that year and then disappeared from the company for the next 9 years, it was clear there was no going home again. No, despite the company trying in vain to recreate the Hulk Hogan character with Lex Luger later in 1993, the golden era was now over, with the official end by some people's metrics coming with the full-blown coronation of Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10. And with a roster going forward which had much less star power overall, a creative direction which would be incredibly ropey, and a massively reduced level of fan interest, it meant the next few years were going to be incredibly difficult for the WWF. Hell, this was the period where they were never closer to going out of business, with it only being the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin in late 1997 which ultimately saved them from bankruptcy. Still, even if the new generation was a low point for many fans, it was a necessary one, as there was just no way the heights of the 80s could have kept going when the world had changed so much by the early to mid-90s. Hell, even if the steroid trial hadn't come along, fans were getting tired of the antics of people like Hulk Hogan anyway, as it all felt a little passé after a decade had passed since it begun. But even if it was no longer popular by 1993 and 1994, when the golden era had been cooking, it had been so hot that it made an entire generation of kids fans for life. Really, if you're of a certain age, then this will always represent the peak of wrestling to you, as it was the first time the industry fully broached the mainstream and became a bona fide pop culture sensation, one in which even mid-card acts on the roster became household names. Was it better than the Attitude Era which came later? That's a debate people still have to this day. Of course, if you believe the golden era was WWE's high watermark, it's no doubt because of iconic moments like Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant, the Mega Powers exploding, and the debut of The Undertaker, just to name a few. Really, it was a time which will never be able to fully be replicated, as it is so tied with the decade in which it happened, a decade in which cartoon superheroes were real, and they could be seen every week taking part in gladiatorial battles of good and evil inside a WWF ring. Of all the eras in WWE's history, the New Generation era is amongst the least celebrated, and the reason for that is because it falls right in the middle of the two boom periods of the Golden Age and the Attitude Era. But that's not to say there weren't some great things to be found in mid-90s WWF, so how did it all happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. It can all be traced back as far as 1992. That was the year when Hulk Hogan made his full-time exit from WWF after his match against Sid Justice at WrestleMania 8. And it wasn't just the Hulkster who would exit stage right over the course of this calendar year. No, a staggering amount of big names would also part ways with Vince McMahon here, with some of the biggest of these being the Ultimate Warrior, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts, Sid, the British Bulldog, and the Legion of Doom. Why were so many people leaving back then? Well, a lot of that could be put down to the biggest scandals in the company's history at that time, the steroid trial. Basically, this was a trial in which Vince McMahon was being charged with overseeing his roster's use of steroids throughout the 80s and into the 90s. So obviously then, with this being such a big news story at the time, it brought a lot of negative PR down on the WWF. And it contributed towards business starting to fall for the first time since the early 80s, as many parents no longer wanted their kids watching the show. But even if those kids had been allowed to keep watching, a good percentage would have probably stopped anyway, because with so many of the big names quitting on account of them no longer being able to maintain their larger-than-life physiques, lest they be busted for steroid use, it meant the roster suddenly looked pretty threadbare. How would Vince McMahon fight back against this fall in the public interest of his product? Well, after he was acquitted by the courts when it could not be proven that he'd personally given PEDs to his wrestlers, he at first tried to simply recreate the Hogan era with whoever he had left, the most physically impressive of which was Lex Luger. and when the Lex Express run flopped spectacularly, he'd be left with no choice but to entirely rethink the way he'd been presenting wrestling up until then. Yes, if pretty much all of the big muscle men of the 80s were now gone, and if all the new body guys the boss were trying to push weren't getting over, then he'd have to start pushing a different type of performer instead. Enter Bret Hart, arguably the best wrestler in the world back in the early 90s. He was someone who had always held a special place in the hearts of a section of the fan base. After all, he offered something different for an audience who were tired of watching the same old copy and paste matches from the likes of Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior. Really, the Calgary native was less of a live-action superhero and more of a high-level athlete, one who used his supreme in-ring skills to full effect every time he stepped inside of the squared circle, and did so in a way which couldn't help but engage fans. So much of a following had Bret built up by 1992, in fact, it would be in the autumn of that year that Vince McMahon had decided to roll the dice on him by having him beat Ric Flair to become WWF champion for the first time. Sadly though, this run on top did not lead to big box office for the company. So it was then that by the time WrestleMania 9 came around in the spring of 1993, the boss would have convinced Hulk Hogan to come back for another run as the champ instead. How would this run go? Not well, as by that point, even the most ardent of Hulkamaniacs were looking for something fresh. So once the Hulkster exited stage right again at King of the Ring later that year, McMahon went back to the drawing board. And it was here that the failed Lex Luger experiment would take place, something which only further solidified the idea in his mind that he needed to go back to Bret Hart. Sure, he may not have been drawing a lot of money, but what Bret offered was a loyal, if relatively small fan base who would tune in to see him. And as well as that, he could also serve as the poster boy for the rebranding of the entire company. That's right, after finally accepting that the golden era was over, it would be at WrestleMania 10 that in front of a packed Madison Square Garden crowd, Vince put the belt back on the Hitman, with this positioning Bret as the guy going forward. And he wasn't the only relatively new act who would be getting the rocket strapped to him here, as at that same show, Bret's brother Owen would score a pinfall win over the man who would end the evening as champ in what remains to this day one of the best pure wrestling matches in WWE history. Then, of course, there was Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon, two people who arguably stole the show right out from under the Hart brothers at WrestleMania 10 with their iconic ladder match. Yes, the message coming out of the showcase of the Immortals that year was clear. WWF was embracing a new kind of star, one who was less about glamour muscles and slow, plodding matches, and was instead all about high-level athleticism, the kind of performer who could put on entertaining bell-to-bell action the likes of which had rarely been seen in WWF before, and which was much more akin to the stuff you'd traditionally find in places such as Jim Crockett Promotions. All that was needed at this point then was to give this burgeoning movement a name, with that being something which came not long after as Vince McMahon officially started using the New Generation branding. How would 1994 progress with this new generation era of WWF now established? Well, it certainly gave us some exciting matches on both pay-per-view and the then still new weekly live show Monday Night Raw. Business would continue to sag overall, as fan interest just wasn't anywhere near the level it had been during the 80s. Why was that? Well, after years of conditioning audiences to see the spectacle of folks like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage as being way more important than anything else, it wasn't going to be easy to make those same audiences get excited about the work now being put on by the less physically impressive stars of WWF. It also didn't help that there were so many of those stars of the 80s now working for World Championship Wrestling. That's right, after Eric Bischoff began bringing in names like Terry Bollea and the Macho Man in 1994, it sent a message to Golden Era WWF fans that WCW was now the company to watch. So, as you would expect then, even more people began tuning out of Vince McMahon's promotion here, because for as much as fans might have been tired of the likes of the Hulkster in WWF, there was still something about those performers which were more exciting to watch for them than the still unproven new generation of stars in WWF. But there was hope still out there for McMahon, hope which came in the form of an 80s-style big man he stumbled across during this period, one who went by the name of Diesel. Yes, after a disastrous initial run in WCW where he'd played the infamous Oz character, Kevin Nash had jumped ship to WWF in 1993 to initially serve as the bodyguard of Shawn Michaels. Over time, though, Big Daddy Cool would start to get more and more over with fans, and this eventually led to his boss deciding he was the guy he was going to go with in order to turn business around once more. No, Diesel wasn't the wrestler that Bret Hart or HBK were. But with it being apparent that great wrestling alone wasn't drawing for the company here, Vince McMahon came to believe that he needed to go back to what worked during the 80s, size and presence. And so that was why, after the Hitman dropped the world title at the 1994 Survivor Series to Bob Backlund, Nash would win that same belt from Backlund days later in a quick squash at Madison Square Garden, as all of a sudden, he became the face of the new generation. So like that, all was solved for the WWF then, right? After all, in Diesel, they'd found someone who, on the face of things, appeared to be a newer version of Hulk Hogan for this new generation. And as if that wasn't enough, he was also someone who was clean when it came to steroids, so there was no way he was going to cause any further headaches for the promotion in that respect. Ultimately though, while things might have looked good on paper with Diesel being on top, it very quickly became apparent that his run was not going to work out, as the fan base who had stuck around were now starting to get more into the great wrestling provided by others on the show, something which Nash just couldn't keep up with. But that didn't stop Vince McMahon from continuing to go with Big Sexy on top for pretty much the entirety of 1995 anyway, as, always stubborn, he felt that he could keep pushing the big man until fans gave in and accepted him. Basically, it was the same thing the boss had tried to do 2 years prior with Lex Luger, and it was the same thing he would try to do again with Roman Reigns decades later. Unlike with Roman though, who eventually came to be embraced by audiences, crowds would only grow more and more tired of Diesel and his run as WWF champion as 1995 progressed. And that wasn't the only thing which was dragging 1995 down and turning it into a year which many to this day still consider to be the worst of WWE's history. No, there was also the fact that the man who should have been the ace of the promotion, Bret Hart, spent much of the entire 12-month period getting wasted in nothing mid-card feuds against the likes of Jean-Pierre Lafitte and Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS. Then, as if it wasn't bad enough, The Undertaker, someone who should have been a world title contender himself, was going through a low point as he felt like he was locked in an endless feud with Ted DiBiase's stable of mid-card jobbers, the $1 Million Corporation. Sure, Shawn Michaels would get a chance to shine when he not only won the Royal Rumble in January, but also ran back his excellent ladder match with Razor Ramon at WrestleMania 10 at SummerSlam in August. But even he suffered overall, as rather than main eventing WrestleMania 11 when he challenged Diesel for the WWF title, he'd instead have to play second fiddle to Lawrence Taylor. That's right, so little faith did Vince McMahon have in his new generation to deliver box office at the Showcase of the Immortals that year, he'd bring in a retired football player to close out the show against Bam Bam Bigelow, as clear of a sign as there could be that he saw his current roster as being second-rate when compared to rosters of the past. And that was what he thought of the best the roster had to offer. So what hope did the undercard have of impressing when they were made up of some truly terrible gimmicks? That's right, we were very much into the wrestlers with jobs era here, the period which gave us lowlights like Duke the Dumpster Drosy, a wrestling garbage man, the Goon, a wrestling hockey player, and the aforementioned Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS, a wrestling dentist. Why did Vince McMahon feel like it was a good idea to go with so many gimmicks like these in 1995? That's anyone's guess. But one thing was for sure, it wasn't working for fans. So when all of this arguably reached its nadir at that year's King of the Ring, a show in which Mabel won the tournament, much to the distaste of a rabid Philadelphia crowd who were already by that point falling in love with Paul Heyman's ECW, it should come as no surprise to learn they booed the whole thing out of the building. And those poor receptions would only continue as the autumn and winter of 1995 came around too. That said, it's not like there was nothing worth watching during this year. No, with the introduction of In Your House as a B-show pay-per-view, it gave sub-performers who would have never gotten time on a pay-per-view before to have some hidden gems here. Hell, even Monday Night Raw would have some great bouts, the most notable of which is probably the one in which the 1-2-3 Kid first made a name for himself by upsetting Razor Ramon. But then, for those in the know, it probably wouldn't have been such a shock that Sean Waltman won this one, as he, by then, was part of a backstage crew which also included Razor, that were in many ways becoming the true power brokers of the company. Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon, the 1-2-3 Kid, and another newcomer to the promotion who went by the name of Hunter Hearst Helmsley. These were the 5 men who, together, came to be known as the Clique. And the reason they were able to wield so much political power behind the scenes during 1995 and into 1996 too was because amongst their ranks were 3 of the top stars in WWF. So with Vince McMahon wanting to appease them at every turn in order to keep them happy, it meant they could pretty much do as they please. Unfortunately for the rest of the roster though, while this worked out great for the Clique as it kept them all in good spots on the card, it didn't work out for many others, as this fivesome was well known for being very difficult to deal with and for taking a dislike to people very easily. And once they took a dislike to someone, as they did with the likes of Dean Douglas, Vader, and countless others, it meant those performers were pretty much screwed politically and would not be getting much in the way of on-screen pushes. Why was Vince McMahon so willing to bend over backwards for the Clique at the expense of everyone else on his roster? Well, with Nitro starting that summer, and now acting as a direct head-to-head competitor against Monday Night Raw, it meant the Monday Night Wars had formally begun. And with Eric Bischoff offering huge money contracts to anyone from WWF who wanted to jump ship to WCW, contracts which the boss simply couldn't match back then as he was in financial dire straits, it put the fear of God into McMahon that either HBK, Hall, or Nash would choose to leave. But then he had a reason to be scared of this because the template had already been set on the debut episode of Nitro, as that was the night in which Lex Luger had jumped over to the side of the enemy in a shock move to most working in WWF. Many of whom were unaware that Luger's contract had even come up. Yes, World Championship Wrestling were now starting to nip at the heels of their competition. Hell, even Vince McMahon's pushing of his competition as being a company made up of old arthritic stars of the past couldn't do anything to stop the slow turning of the tide in favor of Ted Turner. So, feeling like he needed to finally move on from the Diesel experiment then, it would be at Survivor Series 1995 that the boss once more belted up Bret Hart. Not that this would be the Hitman regaining his spot as the ace though. No, this time Hart's title run would only be a transitional one designed to eventually get the belt onto McMahon's new top guy, Shawn Michaels, at WrestleMania 12. And this was where the issues with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels began, as well up to that point both had actually been friends. When HBK allegedly disrespected the Hitman after Bret had put the new champ over in March of 1996, it caused heat to begin developing between the two, heat which would eventually spiral completely out of control. Not that this would be a huge issue yet though, as after losing at WrestleMania 12, Hart would take the majority of 1996 off in order to go film his TV show Lonesome Dove. And while he was gone, Shawn Michaels would fully be solidified as the guy, as between then and November, he'd keep the top prize around his waist. That said, he wouldn't have all of his friends with him this whole time because it would be in the spring of 1996 that Vince McMahon's worst fears were realized, when finally accepting that they were never going to make the kind of money they wanted to make in New Generation era WWF, both Diesel and Razor Ramon accepted a big money contract to go work for WCW. And what's more, pretty much immediately upon arrival there, they'd changed the industry forever with the New World Order angle. The angle which rocketed World Championship Wrestling to the level of #1 promotion in the world, all while making WWF look about as uncool and behind the times as it had ever looked before. Interestingly though, while this was an incredibly dark time for Vince McMahon, it would be within a month of the NWO being created that WWF would find their own savior. They just didn't realize it back when it was happening. Who was this? Well, it would be a then still somewhat up-and-coming talent by the name of Steve Austin. That's right, it was just 2 weeks before Bash at the Beach 1996 at the King of the Ring that Stone Cold won the tournament and then went on to cut his now iconic Austin 3:16 promo. Of course, while some people list this moment as an early start point for the Attitude Era, it wasn't like Austin suddenly became a star overnight after his King of the Ring win or anything. No, for the rest of the summer and throughout the autumn which followed, the Rattlesnake would still be in a pretty nothing role. Instead, it would be Shawn Michaels who continued to lead the charge of the new generation, with him doing this by fending off the challenges of opponents like Vader, Mankind, and Goldust. Unfortunately though, for as excellent as his matches were, and for as much as Shawn was over with the fans who were attending shows, the reality was, like with Diesel, he just wasn't a major draw. No, as 1996 drew to a close, WWF were still in dire straits both creatively and financially. And with WCW now finding their business to be booming off the backs of the game-changing NWO angle over on the other channel, it meant that once again, a change was going to be needed. And in hindsight, the first step toward that change would happen at Survivor Series in November of this year, as not only would this mark the debut of a young blue chipper called Rocky Maivia, someone who we heard might have gone on to have some success in Hollywood later on down the line, but it would also be the night Steve Austin finally arrived during his fantastic one-on-one bout with Bret Hart. Yes, after months of being gone, the Hitman was back, and now that he would spend the rest of 1996 and the start of 1997 continuing to get the Rattlesnake over with an all-timer of a feud between the pair. a feud so good it would eventually lead to perhaps the greatest WWE match of all time at WrestleMania 13. Not that this was supposed to be the original match that night, however. No, the original plan had been for Bret and Shawn to run it back from WrestleMania 12. But once HBK infamously lost his smile in the lead up to the show and had to vacate the WWF title following an alleged knee injury, it meant plans had to be changed on the fly. And while this was great for Steve Austin in the long run, as the double turn which took place between he and Bret in WrestleMania 19 officially turned him into an anti-hero babyface, it left the Hitman feeling betrayed, as he had hoped that Shawn Michaels would be willing to do the honors for him, just as Hart had done for HBK the year prior. As you would expect then, this only intensified the increasingly bitter feelings between the pair, as when they weren't getting into legitimate fights behind the scenes, they were throwing live rounds at one another on live TV. With the most infamous example of this probably being the time Shawn accused Bret of having an affair with Sunny on an episode of Raw. That's right, there was a constant sense of chaos behind the scenes in WWF during 1997. That said, this would have the unintended effect of creating some truly brilliant television, as the promotion underwent what is arguably their best year ever creatively, one which saw The Undertaker finally get something worthy of his gimmick, as instead of dealing with a cavalcade of bad heel gimmicks, he'd get a lengthy run on top as world champion. And then there was the work of folks such as Sid, Vader, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley too, the latter of whom would start an on-screen alliance with Shawn Michaels here, as the pair became known as D-Generation X. Of course, if this sounds like the start of the Attitude Era had already happened here, then we wouldn't blame you for thinking this way, as while the official WWE line always seems to have been that this era began at WrestleMania 14 with Steve Austin's world title win, there's a solid argument to be made that it was already well underway by 1997, as it was there that we got things like the Three Faces of Foley, the original Hell in a Cell match, and the subsequent Kane debut which came with it. Then, of course, there was Bret Hart's excellent heel run, as for a few months there, the entire company was built around a feud between America and Canada. For the purposes of this video, however, we'll go with the idea that this still technically constituted the New Generation era. And the reason we're willing to do that is because while things had certainly turned around creatively, it takes a long time to build momentum. And so that meant for the entirety of 1997, Vince McMahon's promotion eked ever closer to going out of business. Hell, at one point they were outright told by the USA Network that they'd be getting pulled off the airwaves once 1998 began, something which would have been an undeniable death blow to WWE at this point in their history. And as if that weren't bad enough, despite re-signing him to a big money contract the year prior, by the summer of 1997 it became clear to Vince McMahon that he had so little money left he could no longer afford to pay Bret Hart, which was why he gave him his blessing to go negotiate with WCW here. But then something happened. After raising the prices of his B pay-per-views In Your House and finding out that fans were still purchasing the shows in the same numbers, a sudden influx of cash came in and the Hitman could now be paid what he was owed. The only problem with this, though, was that by then Hart had already made a deal with Eric Bischoff, and because he was still the WWF champion here, it meant he would have to drop that belt before he left. So we came to the Montreal Screwjob, one of the most infamous events in all of wrestling history. Now, the details are way too numerous to go into here, but the short version is that Vince McMahon wanted Bret to drop the belt to Shawn Michaels at that year's Survivor Series before he left. But because Bret had creative control over his character for the last 30 days of his run, he chose to turn this down, as by then, the bitterness between Hart and Michaels had become so intense he didn't want to put him over, especially not in his home country of Canada. How did this situation get resolved then? Well, Vince simply chose to screw Bret when he had the referee call for the bell while the Hitman was locked in a sharpshooter that night, making it look like he'd tapped out even though he hadn't, with the boss's reasoning for this being that he didn't want to risk Hart jumping over to WCW with the world title the next evening, just as Medusa had done with the women's title not too long before. As you would expect then, all of this led to McMahon very much being seen as the villain in the situation, and while this could have been disastrous for WWF, in the end it worked out better than anyone could have hoped, as it led to the birth of Mr. McMahon, a character which to this day many still consider to be the greatest heel in wrestling history. So over would this character be in fact that once he started locking horns with Steve Austin again in early 1998, WWF quickly caught fire, as now with the USA Network happy to keep them on the air in the face of rapidly raising ratings, the company entered a boom period. A boom period which would go on to become known as the Attitude Era. But while it's the Attitude Era which people remember fondly today, we would have never gotten to that point had we not had the New Generation Era there to keep things afloat during a very rough period in the mid-90s. Sure, it might not have been perfect, but in serving as a bridge between two boom periods, it did its job well. So don't let this era be remembered as a failure, because even if it wasn't the best period in WWE's history, the new generation was still proof positive that the company could weather the worst of storms and come out of the other end stronger than ever. There have been plenty of popular time periods for wrestling over the decades, from the early TV boom of the 1950s territory scene to the Hulkamania-soaked heights of the 80s, all the way to the modern-day Renaissance. But of them all, perhaps none represented a bigger period of mainstream interest for the industry than the Attitude Era. What made this time period so special and so talked about even to this day? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. It begins, well, in truth, there's a debate about where the Attitude Era actually starts, with some going as far back as the introduction of gold dust as being the origin point. But while that may have been a very early spark for what was to come later, as would Steve Austin's famous King of the Ring victory in June 1996, those moments still very much happened during the time of the New Generation era, a period where WWF was struggling more than it ever had. Why was this? Well, after the heights of the golden era during the 80s, Vince McMahon's promotion had hit some hard times as a combination of the steroid trial and the loss of most of their big stars led to a serious downturn in public interest. And what the promotion were doing to combat this back then certainly wasn't winning anyone back, as even in the mid-90s, the Wrestlers with Jobs era felt more than a little passé. And it only felt even more passé once WCW exploded in popularity with the NWO angle in 1996. On top of that, when compared to what ECW, the real game changer of 90s wrestling, was doing over in Philadelphia around that same time, WWF was in danger of becoming uncool as the rest of the industry passed it by. So what they needed then was a shakeup. And that shakeup would finally begin showing itself in late 1996 as people like Vince Russo were brought into the fold. What was Vince Russo's intention for the company's creative direction going forward? Well, he wanted to ape the success of trash TV successes of the time, like Jerry Springer, in the process creating a wrestling show in which it would be impossible to look away on account of there always being something wild happening at any given moment. And the early ideas he pitched to Vince McMahon here would soon see him be elevated to the level of head writer along with his partner Ed Ferrara. Yes, things were now changing fast within the halls of WWF, and this would lead us to 1997, a crucial year for WWF, as it was the year in which, by many people's estimates, the Attitude Era got going. After all, it was here that Raw underwent a visual change, one which would remain consistent for decades thereafter. And it was also here that a lot more reality started being injected into the show on a regular basis. Take the Bret Hart-Shawn Michaels feud, for example, a genuine rivalry between two performers who had started out as friends, but who had ended up becoming bitter enemies as legitimate heat was allowed to boil over to the point that it started spilling out onto TV. Backstage fights, on-screen verbal battles, and even accusations being thrown around about people having affairs. It all got very bitter very quickly, and as the weeks and months progressed and WWF struggled to get them in the ring together for an actual match, it all made for hugely engrossing TV. Even if you didn't know what was happening between the pair behind the scenes, there was enough anger in their on-screen segments to where you could just tell this was more than just a wrestling angle. And while that was playing itself out, other things would also be heralding a new era in WWF, things like the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Why was this so important? Well, after years of pushing more traditional babyfaces on top, Vince McMahon suddenly struck gold with the anti-hero antics of the Rattlesnake, as he perfectly represented the new direction pop culture was moving in with shows like South Park and music like Eminem. Seriously, Austin's babyface turn at WrestleMania 13 during his submission match against Bret Hart is cited by many to this day as the true start point of the Attitude Era, as after that, things really felt different. Hell, what followed on from here over the remainder of 1997 has been considered by many to be the best stretch of creative WWF ever went through. And another part of the reason it felt so fresh was because at some point during it, Vince McMahon had admitted he was losing touch with what his audience wanted, and so he had told his roster at an all-hands-on-deck meeting that he wanted to give them more creative freedom when it came to developing their own characters moving forward. What a great decision this was then, as it led to people like Mick Foley rising up the card as his Cactus Jack persona finally made it to WWF. And as if that wasn't enough, it also led to Brian Pillman setting the template for any worked shoot angles to come in the decades which followed with his loose cannon antics that blurred the lines between reality and fiction to the point that no one could tell what was happening anymore. Seriously, his Pillman's Got a segment this year was so wild, it very nearly got Raw kicked off the air. But seeing the buzz it had created, Vince McMahon decided to lean further into that kind of context with things like the early days of DX and the initial sparks of a rivalry which would go on to dominate the next few years when in front of a rabid Madison Square Garden crowd on the September 22nd, 1997 episode of Raw, Steve Austin delivered a stone cold stunner to his boss, with this being a line no one had ever dared to cross before at the time. Obviously then, this made for a lot of renewed excitement within the company. That said, for as excellent as 1997 was for WWF on a creative level, they were still being absolutely hammered in TV ratings by WCW, as Nitro's success only continued to grow with the popularity of the New World Order angle. And that almost led to the entire ship sinking, as it was in the autumn of this year that Raw was officially canceled by the USA Network. Or at least it was decided the show would be pulled from the air once their current deal was over a few months later, with this basically meaning that Vince McMahon's promotion was dead in the water, as no TV meant no national exposure anymore, and this was way before a point where wrestling was such a valuable property Raw would have been guaranteed to find a home somewhere else. But then, something happened. After WWF started getting more money coming in after raising the prices of their in-your-house pay-per-views, the boss suddenly found that he could afford to pay Bret Hart's contract again, the contract he'd told him mere months before that he could no longer honor on account of financial difficulties. The only problem, during the intervening time, the Hitman had made a deal with WCW to jump over there. And what's more, he was still the WWF champion, meaning Vince McMahon would now have to hotshot the belt off of him before he left. Yes, what was about to come was the infamous Montreal Screwjob, a story too big to go into here, but one in which the bullet points were basically that Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels' shoot rivalry led to the Hitman getting screwed out of the WWF title for real on live pay-per-view at the Survivor Series, all under the instructions of Vince McMahon himself. Obviously then, this turned the boss into the biggest villain in the industry overnight, something which could have served as a fatal blow for the promotion, but which ended up working out great for them in the end when he decided to lean into this perception and make a top heel out of himself. And that, combined with the continued rise of Steve Austin up the card, as well as Shawn Michaels' never-ending pushing of the boundaries of good taste with D-Generation X, created a situation where WWF started gaining momentum again. Momentum which would lead us into WrestleMania 14, the night which is pretty much considered the start of the Attitude Era by the company. What happened here which is so important? Well, it was the night that Stone Cold beat HBK for the WWF title and formally became the face of this new burgeoning era. Of course, getting a big audience to tune in for WrestleMania was one thing. After all, with a mainstream star like Mike Tyson serving as the special guest enforcer for the main event at that show, it was obvious interest was going to be higher than normal. But getting them to stay after the fact was another thing altogether. Luckily though, WWF just so happened to have what is considered by many to be the greatest angle of all time as a follow-up. What was this angle? Well, it would see new WWF champion Steve Austin play the role of a man of the people as he went to war with Vince McMahon himself, the evil Machiavellian villain of the story who wanted nothing more than to get the belt off of the Rattlesnake and get it onto a more corporate champion instead. Obviously then, it was very easy for a lot of people to identify with the plight of Austin here, especially those who worked in more blue-collar jobs and who hated their own bosses. And it also became very easy for teenagers and young men in the process of rebelling against authority themselves to find a hero in the Rattlesnake. Basically what we're saying here is that the fact WWF exploded in mainstream popularity at this time should come as no surprise. What would have been a surprise to people back then, though, was how quickly things had turned around, as mere months before, this was a promotion which was on the verge of death, with it literally only being saved by going under once the USA Network saw how many viewers Stone Cold was bringing in and decided to do a 180 and renew Raw instead of canceling it. Of course, it wasn't just Steve Austin's constant battles with Vince McMahon and the hand-picked challengers the boss would throw at his champion which was drawing new fans in here. No, it was also things like the excellent brother versus brother feud between The Undertaker and Kane, with this being a slow burn storyline which had started off early on in 1997 and which was still peaking as 1998 got into full swing. Then of course there was the babyface turn of a now Triple H-led DX post Shawn Michaels' retirement on account of injury, Mick Foley's continued excellent character work across his three different incarnations, Mankind, Dude Love, and Cactus Jack, and a rise of another top star and a young rookie named The Rock. Yes, another key factor in the Attitude Era being as special as it was is the fact that unlike any other time period in wrestling before or after, it had two generational stars at its helm. Basically, with Steve Austin and The Rock, they had two Hulk Hogans at the same time. And below them, the rest of the roster was absolutely stacked with star power from top to bottom, with this all leading to a situation where, come the end of 1998, WWF was already starting to leave WCW in the dust as the pendulum of the Monday Night Wars fully shifted in WWF's favor. But then how couldn't they when so many iconic moments which are still talked about fondly to this day happened during that 12-month period? Come on now, aside from Stone Cold winning the big one at WrestleMania 14, 1998 was also the year which gave us scenes such as Mick Foley's insane, death-defying Hell in a Cell bump at King of the Ring, DX invading Nitro in a Jeep on an episode of Raw, the Rattlesnake driving a Zamboni down to the ring in order to get at Vince McMahon, Mick Foley and Terry Funk being packed into a dumpster and then thrown off the entrance ramp, and The Rock turning heel after winning the Deadly Games tournament at Survivor Series. Basically, all of this is to say that it was exactly what Vince Russo had planned for when he first took over the book. Crash TV, which you couldn't look away from, and that led to big-time ratings for Vince McMahon and company as wrestling, particularly WWF and not WCW now, became the talk of the pop culture landscape. And as 1999 got going, the craziness would only increase, and the gap between WWF and WCW only widen, as Steve Austin's WrestleMania 15 bout against The Rock marked the first of 3 times this pair would main event the Showcase of the Immortals. So much momentum was WWF building here, in fact, they'd even started to get a bunch of WCW talent to jump ship, and young talent at that. We're talking about names like Chris Jericho and The Big Show here. And while they were getting settled in, other crazy scenes like Stone Cold giving the corporation a beer bath when he drove a Coors truck down to the ring, the reveal of the higher power after months of speculation, the Rock and Sock Connection's famous This Is Your Life segment, and Mick Foley's iconic first world title win, set to the sound of one of the largest pops in wrestling history, would be continuing to draw in massive TV ratings every week. Sadly though, a few things would happen in the autumn of this year which threatened to halt all the momentum that the company had built, the first of which was the exit of the show's head writers Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara. Why had Russo and Ferrara chosen to leave WWF here? Well, after the introduction of the company's second live weekly show, SmackDown, that summer, the pair became burnt out trying to keep up with new creative, especially when Vince McMahon wanted them to do this for the same amount of money they'd been getting paid before. So, seeing an opportunity to help boost the now struggling WCW, the duo jumped over there instead, leaving the WWF rudderless for a short time. But that wasn't the only issue WWF was going through back then. No, they were also having to deal with the exit of their top star for the foreseeable future. What happened here? Well, after a serious neck injury he'd picked up in the summer of 1997 had never been allowed to heal properly, Steve Austin suddenly hit a wall in terms of being able to perform, with this leaving him with no choice but to get neck fusion surgery, something which would put him on the shelf for the next year. As you would expect then, these two things combined could have struck a critical blow to WWF. Hell, Austin leaving alone could have been a fatal strike. After all, the company was already starting to get some pushback on account of things like the increased edginess of the product, as well as the passing of Owen Hart in May of 1999. Luckily though, they had another ace waiting right there in Dwayne Johnson. And so it was that, as Triple H was elevated to the status of top heel, The Rock would slip into the role of top babyface, with this leading to them spending much of 2000 feuding with one another over the WWF title. What was happening aside from that which made 2000 another year many consider to be the greatest in WWE's history? Well, an influx of new talent brought the work rate, something which made this feel like a second stage of the Attitude Era was beginning. That's right, after the first couple of years had been characterized by a lot of kick-punch brawling main events, something which had partially been done in order to accommodate for a physically compromised Steve Austin, new additions to the roster here such as Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, and Eddie Guerrero suddenly led to some high work rate matches taking place on not only Raw and SmackDown, but also pay-per-view. And they weren't the only big changes happening to the roster during 2000, as it would also be here that we'd see some of the women not named Chyna start to rise in prominence, specifically Trish Stratus and Lita. As well as that, tag team wrestling would undergo something of a renaissance in WWF when the Hardy Boys, the Dudley Boys, and Edge and Christian all worked together to set a new bar for the division during their Triangle Ladder match at WrestleMania 2000, and then their TLC 1 rematch at SummerSlam a few months later. That said, for as great as this was, it would be the main event scene which was continuing to anchor everything, a division which was being led by The Rock and, to a lesser extent, Triple H. Hell, even the retirement of Mick Foley in early 2000 couldn't slow things down, as once The Undertaker returned from his own injury with an all-new American Badass incarnation, it would fill the gap left by Foley. And while Vince McMahon was still playing a top heel authority figure, he wouldn't be the only McMahon on screen anymore, as by then both of his children, Shane and Stephanie, had become prominent TV figures, with this being when Stephanie got kayfabe married to her future real-life husband Triple H in order to start the McMahon-Helmsley era angle. Sure, by then, some of the more outrageous characters of the early years of the Attitude Era, like The Godfather and Val Venus, were being phased out on account of backlash from parents groups, but the edginess certainly remained overall. The only difference was that, now with Chris Kresge taking over as the head of creative, the whole thing had felt like it had a stronger sense of structure than it had when Vince Russo had been in control of the book. Really, this was the best of everything in many ways, and arguably a high watermark for WWE as a whole, as business had never been hotter and mainstream interest had never been greater. Yes, back then you couldn't move around the playground without seeing someone wearing an Austin 316 t-shirt or talking about what had happened on Raw the night prior. Even when shows like WrestleMania 2000 didn't hit, or when angles like Rikishi being revealed as the man who had kayfabe run Steve Austin over the year prior flopped, it did nothing to hurt the company's popularity, as they were so white-hot they were able to withstand this easily. So when Stone Cold did finally return from his injury in the autumn, he was able to walk back into a promotion which hadn't skipped a beat in his absence. Hell, at this point there was now a question for the first time as to who the true top star of the WWF was, Austin or The Rock, and that competition between the two to be the ace only pushed each to continue taking the company to even greater heights as 2000 came to a close with the staggering star power of a six-man Armageddon Hell in a Cell match featuring the Rattlesnake, the People's Champion, Triple H, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle, and Rikishi. That said, it wasn't like everything was perfect with Vince McMahon's promotion back then, as while it was now so hot it was on the verge of putting its competition out of business, it wasn't without lowlights too. No, while there was undoubtedly a lot of great stuff which happened during it, there was a fair amount of bad too. And we're not just talking about bad angles like Mark Henry and Mae Young's romance, Rikishi's heel turn, and the infamous Brawl for All, and the overall pushing of the bar to the point that the levels of violence became simply too much for some to bear. Sure, wrestling had been violent before, and it would continue to be violent afterwards, but because this was a time period being so heavily marketed toward teenagers, it left many parents unhappy with what Vince McMahon was putting out there. Unsurprisingly then, that would continue to be a sentiment these groups held as 2001 came along and the boom period would reach another level again. What no one realized at the time, however, was that this period would also mark the end stretch, and the reasons the end was coming here would be numerous, even if there was one main one. Before that happened though, things would continue going strong as arguably the greatest ever edition of the Royal Rumble took place and saw a stacked field of competitors be eliminated one by one, leaving only Stone Cold Steve Austin remaining. Obviously then, with The Rock winning the WWF title from Kurt Angle the following month at No Way Out, this was setting up the biggest match possible which the company had in the chamber for WrestleMania 17, Austin Rock 2 for the gold. And what made this different from the WrestleMania 15 encounter was that by now, both were babyfaces, and both had real claims as to which one was the face of the Attitude Era. Of course, while this was a major main event for the show, it wasn't the main story heading into the event in many ways, as it would be mere days before WrestleMania 17 that the Monday Night Wars formally came to an end, when Vince McMahon purchased WCW for pennies on the dollar. And while the storyline following on from this would be that Shane McMahon had actually bought the promotion right out from under his father's nose and would from there be running it as a competitor once more, it was clear to everyone that in reality this was the end of an era. Why was that? Well, with ECW being gone too, and there truly being no one else left to push WWF to be its best anymore, they'd start to lose momentum very quickly. Sure, WrestleMania 17 would be great, an all-timer in fact. Seriously, to this day, many consider it to be the greatest wrestling show of all time, but when it ended with Steve Austin turning heel and joining forces with Vince McMahon in order to win the WWF title from The Rock, it was immediately clear that a huge mistake had been made. After all, no one wanted to boo Steve Austin back in 2001. Hell, he was the reason so many people had started watching again in 1998. So to see him go to the dark side and align himself with the man he'd been fighting for all those years, well, it felt like a complete betrayal of the character fans had fallen in love with. And you could see the effects of this decision almost instantaneously, as within a matter of weeks, interest in the WWF product felt like it had cooled off significantly. That said, there were other factors at play when explaining why things cooled off so much after WrestleMania 17. For one, there was the fact that, with The Rock disappearing to film a movie here, there was no big babyface to step up and oppose the Rattlesnake. And on top of that, there was the reality that there was a definite sense of creative burnout within the company overall now that they didn't have WCW breathing down their necks and forcing them to keep going at full speed. Then of course there was the disaster that was the Invasion angle, an angle which should have been a surefire hit as it promised the ultimate wrestling crossover of the World Wrestling Federation versus World Championship Wrestling. In the end though, with so few of the big WCW names being present for this, it quickly turned into WWF versus WWF with some WCW and ECW guys along for the ride, not what anyone was interested in seeing back then. Mainly though, it was the Steve Austin heel turn which has been credited with ending the Attitude Era, with many today marking WrestleMania 17 as the official end point. And in a way that's fitting, as if things started with Stone Cold's rise, then it only made sense and should close out with his fall. Ultimately though, it's the fact this has never been recreated again in the years since which has made the myth of the Attitude Era so strong, as today it feels like such a unicorn. Hell, the only other period in WWE's history which it can be compared to is the golden era of the 80s. And while that era was undoubtedly a boom period too, it doesn't have the same cool factor that the turn of the millennium has in people's memory today, largely because that period appealed to a more adult audience, one who were looking for an edgier and grittier product overall. Yes, there were a lot of elements which came together to make the Attitude Era special, with the Austin vs. McMahon angle probably being the key factor, which is likely why so many people stopped watching the second these two enemies joined forces. But even if they left and some never returned, the memories of what they watched back then will continue to live on, as even today, the nostalgia of the turn of the millennium period continues to be strong. And that's understandable, as it was a time when wrestling truly felt cool and where you had to tune in every week as you truly didn't know what was going to happen once the show got started. There have been a lot of eras in WWE's history, and of those eras, the two most celebrated are probably the Golden Era and the Attitude Era. But there's another hidden gem in there, one which to some fans is even better than those periods. What is that hidden gem? Well, it's the time which came along during the 2000s, known simply as the Ruthless Aggression Era. But just what made it so special? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. It all started in 2001, sort of. It was then that after the Attitude Era came to a dramatic and abrupt end in the spring of this year when Stone Cold Steve Austin turned heel at WrestleMania 17, WWF were left scrambling to try and keep momentum going. Unfortunately though, their first attempt at doing that would prove to be a monumental flop, as despite the idea of WWF versus WCW feeling like an easy home run hit, it was mishandled to the point that it's since gone down in infamy. So after that angle came to an end and Vince McMahon realized he was going to need to take things in a new direction if he wanted to stop the bleeding when it came to fans tuning out in droves, he decided upon something in the summer of 2002. What would that new direction be? Well, it would be summed up with two words: ruthless aggression. Those were the words the boss spoke to the roster as he stood in the middle of the ring on the July 24th episode of Raw, surrounded by everyone on the Red brand who he was looking to motivate. And the reason it was only the Red brand who were there was because, by this point, the brand split had taken place and both Raw and SmackDown had been divided up into two distinct groups of performers, with the former being led by Ric Flair and then later former WCW boss Eric Bischoff, and the latter being led by Vince McMahon himself and then later his daughter Stephanie. Obviously then, this meant that each show would be competing with each other in order to try and best represent Vince McMahon's new vision going forward. The only problem was, during those early days at least, it wasn't fully clear what ruthless aggression was supposed to be. What separated the killer instinct the boss wanted his roster to show here from the same killer instinct that they'd been showing during the Attitude Era? That was something everyone had to figure out. And one of the first people to make a real attempt at this would be John Cena, someone who made his SmackDown debut not long after to challenge Kurt Angle during the Olympic Heroes weekly open challenge gimmick he was doing at the time. Obviously then, this would prove to be a key moment in retrospect because, while Cena would lose this match, and while he would still be an up-and-comer for a while yet, over time he would end up becoming the face of this era in many ways. For the time being, however, the big names of WWF, or WWE as it had now been rebranded following a lawsuit the World Wildlife Fund had successfully filed against the company for improper usage of the initials, would continue to be the same big names of the Attitude Era. That said, this would start to change when, at WrestleMania 19, Steve Austin would quietly retire from the ring. Clearly then, this represented a huge changing of the guards. And with it being combined with the fact that The Rock already had one foot out the door here too as he set about going to dominate Hollywood, it meant some new big names were going to have to rise to the top. Enter Brock Lesnar, the first of the famous OVW class of 2002 who would fully rise to the forefront in WWE, as after making a huge splash on the Raw after WrestleMania 18, he'd risen to the top in record time to the point that he'd won the undisputed title at SummerSlam later that year and had then gone on to main event WrestleMania 19 against Kurt Angle. Unfortunately for Vince McMahon, however, while Brock may have seemed like the answer to all his problems, as not only was he a physical specimen unlike any other, but he could also go in the ring to a high level, the Beast's time in WWE would ultimately prove to be short-lived. Why was that? Well, because by the time WrestleMania 20 came around, Lesnar would have already grown tired of the brutal WWE road schedule, with this being a major contributing factor in him deciding to exit stage right here and instead eventually move on to a career in UFC where he became an even bigger star. And once Vince McMahon realized Brock was not going to be his new Steve Austin, he had to quickly change direction and figure out who else he was going to push in that spot. Who would he go with here? Well, on the Raw side of the equation, there was already one big name who had clearly set himself apart, and that would be the boss's own son-in-law, Triple H. Yes, despite breaking out as a main event act during the Attitude Era, the game had always spent that time living in the shadow of both Steve Austin and The Rock. Hell, you could argue he was also in the shadow of people like Mick Foley and The Undertaker too. Once 3 out of 4 of those people were gone, however, the future creative head of WWE would be able to settle into a role as the top dog on the Raw brand. Unfortunately, though, this would not be a period which was well received by fans, so much so that it would go on to become known as the Reign of Terror. Why was this? Well, for a near 3-year period, the game would do everything he could to turn himself into Harley Race, more often than not at the expense of everyone around him. That's right, there were a lot of people who could have been elevated to the level of superstardom here, most of them people who had finally come in from WCW or ECW following the fall of those two promotions, but in the end, none of them would be able to excel as well as they should have, as Triple H would always be standing tall over them by the time their feud was over. We're talking about names like Scott Steiner, Rob Van Dam, Bill Goldberg, and perhaps most infamously, Booker T here. Every one of them was damaged by the Reign of Terror. And that was only the tip of the iceberg in many ways when it came to this period's woes, at least as far as the Red brand was concerned. Yes, there were also some pretty ropey storylines going on here too, ones which were largely trying and failing to recapture the Crash TV feeling of the Attitude Era. And each of them only added to the sense that Raw was stuck in the past and needed something which was going to shake it up. That said, it wasn't like there wasn't good stuff to be found on the Red brand here, as Triple H did give us Evolution, a modern-day Four Horsemen stable which would be made up of him, Ric Flair, and the other two notable names from that famous OVW class of 2002 not named Brock Lesnar and John Cena, with those being Randy Orton and Dave Bautista. Then of course there was the rise of people like Chris Jericho, someone who finally made it to the main event level during the early days of the Ruthless Aggression era after years of being undervalued. And as if that wasn't enough, it would also be here that the women first got any semblance of being taken seriously when the likes of Trish Stratus, Lita, Molly Holly, Victoria, and more rose to the forefront. Sure, we'd still be a long way off from the women's revolution which would come later, and there would still be plenty of bad that the ladies had to put up with during the early 2000s, but the fact that they were allowed to have competitive wrestling matches at all was a sign of progress being made in the right direction. Really though, the general consensus among fans at this time was that, while Raw certainly had its highlights, the good show to watch if you were a wrestling fan was SmackDown. Why was that? Well, this was the era of the SmackDown 6. That's right, once Paul Heyman took the creative reins of the Blue brand, he'd start focusing the show much more on in-ring action, with the key sextet of performers he used to promote this style being Kurt Angle, Edge, Chris Benoit, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Chavo Guerrero. Take any of these performers in any combination back in the early 2000s and you were bound to get a banger. And they weren't the only things making SmackDown the A show of the people here. Now aside from that, you had Brock Lesnar, someone who hadn't yet made his exit here, on top of the card and putting on some truly dominating performances at every turn against the likes of The Undertaker and the Olympic gold medalists. Of course, once Brock did leave in 2004 then, it left a gap in the main event scene, one which, for a while at least, was filled by Eddie Guerrero following his iconic WWE title win at No Way Out that February, one of the most feel-good moments in wrestling history. In the long term, however, it was never going to be Eddie Guerrero who was going to lead the charge for the Ruthless Aggression era, just as it was never going to be Chris Benoit who did this once he was moved over to Raw for a while. No, despite both of these men ending WrestleMania 20 by celebrating in the ring with their newly won WWE and World Heavyweight titles, by that summer, each would be getting pushed back down the card as new champs took their place in the form of JBL and Triple H once more. Thankfully though, this time these runs on top would only be transitional ones from the heels, ones designed to set up the true crowning of the next generation, a crowning which would finally happen at WrestleMania 21 in the spring of 2005. Who would be the new faces of this generation who were crowned at that show? Well, it would be two of the three remaining members of that OVW class of 2002, John Cena and Dave Bautista. Yes, after spending the better part of a year rising up the card as United States Champion, it would be at the 21st annual Showcase of the Immortals that Big Match John became the ace of SmackDown when he beat JBL for the WWE title. And meanwhile, as that was happening, Big Dave would be closing out the hottest angle the company had put on in years when, after splitting from Evolution and subsequently turning babyface, he'd managed to relieve Triple H of his World Heavyweight title in the main event and formally end the Reign of Terror in the process. What was happening with Randy Orton, the other member of that 2002 OVW class, while this was going on? Well, he would reach superstardom too. In fact, he was the first of the three to become world champion when he beat Chris Benoit at SummerSlam the year prior for the honor, with that making him the youngest world champion in WWE history, a record he holds to this day. Ultimately though, his title run would be cut short and he'd be de-pushed for a little while, with this partially being a result of the notorious attitude problems he was having behind the scenes back then. That's right, similar to how 90s Shawn Michaels was almost impossible to work with, young Randy Orton also proved to be a major headache for those around him. And that led to him falling into the spot of being a solid third place behind Cena and Batista for a while. Not that he was getting nothing to work with at this point, of course. Though at WrestleMania 21, he'd have a classic with The Undertaker, one which pretty much set the template for the streak bouts which were to come in the decade following. And speaking of Shawn Michaels, he'd also be having quite a time here as, following his return to the ring in 2002 after suffering what was at the time believed to be a career-ending back injury, he'd once more be a focal point of the Raw brand in his own right. That said, HBK was very much in the role of semi-legend here, not someone who the entire show was being built around anymore. No, that spot remained Dave Bautista's and John Cena's for Raw and SmackDown brands respectively, but things were about to change even with this dynamic, as during the 2005 WWE Draft, each man would be moved to the opposite show, with them taking the respective title belts with them. Why was this being done? Well, despite SmackDown still arguably being the better show in 2005, Raw remained the flagship, the one which got the highest viewership on account of it having the most cash with casual fans. So when Vince McMahon decided that they were going to go with John Cena as their true ace over Batista, they made the decision to move him and his WWE title over to the main show. Still, even if this was a loss for SmackDown, they did get a strong replacement in Big Dave during the trade. And they also continued to have the ultimate legend in the company back then, The Undertaker, someone who had become synonymous with the Blue brand by that point. And as if that wasn't enough, they also had the company's cruiserweight division as an exclusive, with this meaning they were able to feature the high-flying antics of performers such as Billy Kidman, Paul London, and Brian Kendrick on a regular basis. And they'd also eventually have Edge as an exclusive too, another huge star who'd risen up the ranks during the mid-2000s and turned himself into a bona fide main event act after turning heel and winning the inaugural Money in the Bank contract. Hell, so high would the Rated R superstar rise here, he'd at one point feel like the main rival to John Cena, especially when he was beating him for the world title. That said, for as much as Edge would go on to become a key player for SmackDown during the latter half of the Ruthless Aggression era, the first part of it would see him be featured as a Raw act, as, with Lita by his side, he was booed out of every arena he entered. And that gave us one of the more memorable angles of the mid-2000s when he started an on-screen rivalry with Matt Hardy, one which blurred the lines of reality and fiction, as it was built upon the fact that Edge and Lita had been having a real-life affair behind version 1's back. Of course, as scandals go, however, this was nothing compared to what would happen in November of 2005, as that was when, to the shock of everyone in the industry, Eddie Guerrero passed away suddenly. What had happened to him? Well, after years of steroid abuse had taken a huge toll on him and enlarged his heart to a dangerous size, it finally gave out, and he was found by his nephew Chavo on the floor of his hotel room. So as you would expect then, this, combined with all the other cases of wrestlers in their 30s and 40s who were passing away for similar reasons at that point in time, led to WWE instituting a new wellness policy, one which would help them take care of the health of performers on their roster, all while avoiding some of the bad PR which was now coming their way. Still though, even if this would help to get the substance abuse issues in the locker room under control somewhat, it wouldn't fix the Eddie-sized hole which was now left in fans' hearts. No, the only thing which came close to doing this was when, in honor of his fallen friend, Rey Mysterio won the 2006 Royal Rumble and then went on to WrestleMania 22 where he beat both Kurt Angle and Randy Orton in a triple threat match to become the new World Heavyweight Champion. What was happening over on Raw while this story was dominating SmackDown? Well, aside from John Cena's continued run as the ace of the brand, the big story would be the reunion of D-Generation X under its original two members, Shawn Michaels and Triple H. That said, this would be a very different DX to the one which existed in the 90s, as by then both men were older and, in the case of HBK, he'd found God and become a born-again Christian, meaning the same risque antics they'd gotten up to during the 90s just wouldn't fly anymore. As you'd expect then, for some fans who remembered the pair for that initial run, this all felt like a bit of a watered-down retread, a pale imitation of what had come before. But for kids who missed out on the Attitude Era and who were seeing DX for the first time here, it was all still fresh and was entertaining enough to get them tuning in every week as the pair went to war with the McMahon family and their hand-picked roster of minions like the Spirit Squad. And again, it wasn't like DX were being asked to carry the show in 2006. No, by that point, even Triple H had taken a step back from feeling the need to be the focus of Raw every Monday night, as instead, the new generation were fully in control at the top, with the main four of these now being John Cena, Batista, Randy Orton, and Edge. Yes, WWE had managed to finally solidify a new generation of stars to take over the old ones and make the Ruthless Aggression era feel like something distinct from times prior. And that meant it now no longer came across as a company all about the Crash TV stylings of the Attitude Era for the most part, or the cartoon theatrics of the Golden Era for that matter, even if Big Match John felt like a very Hulk Hogan-coded act. But there were still some problems deeply rooted into the direction Vince McMahon's promotion was going in here, the biggest of which was probably the overall fan response to John Cena. You see, while Big Match John had gotten very over with fans during his early run as the Doctor of Thugonomics, a cocky, streetwise rapping heel who'd eventually have to turn babyface as a result of audience demand, once he won the WWE title at WrestleMania 21 and was formally coronated as the face of the company, Vince McMahon felt the character wasn't child-friendly enough. So at this point, Cena would be rebranded as the hustle, loyalty, and respect-preaching super babyface most people know him as being today, a change which was indeed a hit with young kids, but which was not well received by adult males. No, for the generation who still remembered the days of Steve Austin and his rebellious antics being on top, this felt like a step backwards for the company. And that section of the fan base would let their feelings be known on a regular basis as, from about mid-2005 onward, John Cena would get mixed reactions at best and would be wildly booed out of buildings at worst. It didn't matter who WWE threw up against him in order to try and get fan sentiment back on the champ's side, no one could change their feelings toward the West Newbury native. Not Triple H, not Chris Jericho, not even Kurt Angle. And that would never be more obvious than at One Night Stand 2006, the second edition of an ECW revival which had started the year prior. Why was that? Well, it was at this show that in the main event, Big Match John received one of the most vicious crowd rejections of all time, with it being here that the iconic "If Cena wins, we riot" fan sign originated. Of course, given this was an ECW crowd, it was always going to be more than a little bit extra in favor of Rob Van Dam, the man who ended up dethroning the champ that night. After all, Paul Heyman's renegade group of misfits had always stood in opposition to WWE. So that's why it was ultimately so disappointing for so many fans when, after One Night Stand 2, Vince McMahon decided to revive the old brand that he now owned the rights to as a weekly show, one which would soon become known as WWECW. Why would it become known as this? Well, it quickly became apparent that this was not going to be a show which maintained the same spirit as the hardcore brand had back in the day over in Philly. No, what WWE put out here very much felt like a parody of ECW in many ways, a parody which would ultimately act more like a developmental league for the promotion, not too dissimilar to what NXT would later become. Sure, Vince McMahon would try to give some legitimacy to the whole thing at points, but any attempts to do this would only backfire, as not only would Rob Van Dam's world title reign end up getting cut short when he was busted for smoking weed during a car ride with Sabu, but additions to the Extreme brand like Kurt Angle would exit stage right before 2007 arrived. That's right, it was in 2006 that the Olympic hero left WWE after his own substance abuse issues got so bad that WWE felt like they could no longer keep him on their books. Obviously then, this marked a turning point in the Ruthless Aggression era, as it meant another one of its most notable names was no longer there, and what's more, it meant Angle would never get to have his planned WrestleMania match against The Undertaker. What a shame that was then, as by this point the Deadman was about to start a string of classics at the showcase of the Immortal, which would create a streak within a streak of sorts, with the first of these happening at WrestleMania 23 during his one-on-one bout with Batista. And that wasn't the only big thing starting for WWE in 2007, as this would also be the year that CM Punk started his rise up the card. No, he wouldn't yet be anywhere near the level he'd eventually reach in 2011 with his famous pipe bomb promo, but across 2007 and 2008, the Second City Saint would begin his ascent by doing things like winning the Money in the Bank contract, becoming World Heavyweight Champion, and having a very memorable feud with Jeff Hardy. And while he was doing this, over in the women's division, things were continuing to get stronger as the likes of Mickie James were now entering the fray, with it being her who had probably the best women's program of the era against Trish Stratus here. Unfortunately though, this period would also mark one of the biggest scandals in wrestling history, and the event which in many ways brought the Ruthless Aggression era to an end, as it was in June of 2007 that the infamous Chris Benoit incident happened. Yes, we all know the gory details of this one by now, so we won't go into it too much here, but suffice it to say, when the story broke and it became major worldwide news, it shone a very negative light on WWE, so just as they had instituted the wellness policy following the passing of Eddie Guerrero in 2005, WWE would now implement a ban on things like chair shots to the head going forward, all while they were also putting stricter restrictions on wrestlers returning to the ring after they'd suffered a concussion. As for how they would handle Benoit himself, well, Vince McMahon would understandably choose to never mention the Canadian's name on television again, with him being effectively erased from the company's history here as WWE once more tried to clean up its image in order to quell the public backlash. And that would all lead to 2008, the year that the Ruthless Aggression era officially came to an end. That's right, while other eras often have a more vague endpoint, we can actually pinpoint the exact moment this period came to a close, as it would be on July 22, 2008, that the company formally went PG. Why had they gone PG here? Well, as you would expect, a major factor was the Chris Benoit situation, as WWE still wanted to distance themselves from that incident as much as they could here, with the best way of doing this being to move the entire direction of the company in a more child-friendly direction. But it wasn't the only reason. No, there was also the fact that new sponsors, such as Mattel being brought on board, meant Vince McMahon simply wasn't going to be able to get away with some of the more salacious elements of his product he'd enjoyed putting out there prior to that. Obviously then, this meant the last pay-per-view which the era would give us would be July 2008's The Great American Bash, a pretty good way to go out as it happened, because it was the show which gave us an excellent Chris Jericho-Shawn Michaels bout, one of the highlights of their great feud that year in fact. And on top of that, it would also highlight so many of the names which had made the 2000s so special for WWE, as performers like John Cena, Batista, Edge, and Triple H were all given prominent spots on the card. Hell, it would even be the last time that Vince McMahon would officially sanction the use of blood on one of his shows, with this not happening again until the TKO era over a decade later. Yes, for as much as it never achieved the same level of mainstream success that either the Golden Era or the Attitude Era did, the Ruthless Aggression Era was quietly one of the best the company ever produced. WWE's PG era has often gone underrated by many fans. And that's a shame because while it didn't have the same peaks as some other periods did, most notably the Golden Era and the Attitude Era, there was some great stuff to be found in there. Yes, even if the low points were low, the high points were notable too, as this was when the company fully settled into becoming an institution that was destined to be around for a long, long time. But how did it all happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. Throughout the 2000s, WWE had been a company which often felt like it was trying to rediscover who it was following the heights of the Attitude Era, and this could be seen in the early parts of the decade where it still seemed to be living off of the fumes of the Crash TV style of Vince Russo, the mid-2000s where it was establishing a new group of top stars in John Cena, Dave Batista, Randy Orton, and Edge, or the late 2000s, where after the Chris Benoit incident created a major worldwide news story, Vince McMahon fully had to tone down the edgier parts of his product. Yes, when WWE decided to move in a more PG direction in 2008, it was partially out of necessity. Of course, it wasn't just the Benoit story which led to WWE going PG in 2008 though. No, there were also things like the company's new sponsorship deal with toy maker Mattel, a sponsorship deal which required the product to be more child-friendly overall. And then there was Linda McMahon's initial foray into politics, another key factor when it came to Vince McMahon deciding to clean things up on TV as, in theory, this would make it harder for his wife's political opponents to find easy ammunition to use against her. That's right, there were multiple reasons for the change, and they all led to July 22nd of 2008, the date the promotion formally announced its shift in overall direction. What would this mean in terms of the on-screen product? Well, the days of things like blood and bad language being used, or some of the more violent matches being seen on TV were now gone, as the whole show started to feel more in line with what had previously been seen during the Golden Era. Understandably then, for fans who had grown up on the edgy antics of the Attitude Era and the still somewhat more adult antics of the Ruthless Aggression Era, this was a surprising and not always welcome move. No, there were plenty of people who hated this change, as to them, it felt like they were losing out on something they loved about the company. That said, while these fans wouldn't be all in on the new PG era, they'd still be watching the product for the most part, as by then we were long past the days of the Monday Night Wars. So for that reason then, if you wanted to see big league wrestling in North America, it was WWE or nothing. And the kids who had been enjoying the show before largely seemed to keep enjoying it here too, as to them, it must have felt like the logical next step for a company that had already been built around a kid-friendly superhero in John Cena for years already. Someone who himself adapted easily to the change in direction. Of course, not all of the wrestlers were happy with the new limitations, however, especially not those legends who'd been around during the late 90s, but they'd quickly learn to work around these and reinvent themselves wherever necessary. And that was evident during the early months of this era when Chris Jericho and Shawn Michaels were able to masterfully segue their excellent Feud of the Year contender over into this new blood-free style without skipping a beat. Yes, it's hard to believe that such a great program actually crossed the line dividing the Ruthless Aggression era and the PG era, because it was just as strong throughout, but it did. And it proved early on that this new period in the company's history was not going to be the complete handcuffing that some feared it would be. Hell, there were even some other performers not named John Cena who actually welcomed this change in direction, as while the Ruthless Aggression era had been popular with the core fan base, it was undeniably getting stale come the end of the 2000s, largely because it felt like WWE was resting on its laurels with repetitive creative and the same group of stars clogging up the main event scene over and over again. So for those who were happy with the change, it represented a chance to rethink things and maybe even get extra creative, something which a lot of great artists have done historically when limitations have been placed upon them. And no one was more happy to embrace this change in creative direction than the women's division, a division which had long been reduced to a sideshow act come 2008. After all, even with the efforts of people like Trish Stratus, Lita, Mickie James, just to name a few, it had been all too easy for them to end up becoming the bathroom break match of any given show, an excuse for titillation as they took part in bikini contests and feuds centered around Playboy shoots. Now that the PG era meant such things would no longer fly though, that changed, and things started going in a better direction for the ladies, one in which they'd be treated more seriously. Sure, we were still a long way from the women's revolution of the mid-2010s, the period where performers such as Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, and Bayley completely changed the game for the division. Hell, it remained the Divas era for the time being. But at least now this Divas era was less about watching the women being forced to show off their bodies for a largely male audience, and more about them bringing in a new audience of young women through things like Total Divas, and later Total Bellas too, something which fully came to fruition as the 2010s got going. So needless to say then, all of this made sponsors and shareholders very happy, as with WWE long since having become a publicly traded company by then, it made them much more attractive to Wall Street as more and more high-level sponsors were brought on board. Really, for as much as a percentage of the audience were unhappy with how things were going, the fact that so many parents now felt comfortable letting their children watch again was a big part of the reason Vince McMahon's promotion was able to turn into a juggernaut institution here. Yes, it had been very successful before, but the PG era to come would mark the point where it officially became too big to fail, as the money being brought in by the more child-friendly content of the show reached staggering levels. Seriously, while WWE had always branded themselves as sports entertainment, this was the point they fully leaned away from being a mere wrestling company and more into the idea of being a multimedia empire, one with its own movie division, dedicated training center for rookies, and eventually a streaming service. That said, all of this was behind-the-scenes stuff more attractive to businessmen than it was to average fans. No, for the average fans, the focus still remained on the TV product. And what they really wanted to see from this as the new decade approached was some new stars getting pushed. Sadly though, there wouldn't be a huge amount of that happening here, not right away at least. No, in terms of the names who were dominating the show, that would largely remain the same for the rest of the decade, with names such as the aforementioned John Cena, Dave Bautista, Randy Orton, and Edge controlling the main event scene, alongside others like Triple H, The Undertaker, Chris Jericho, and Shawn Michaels. Hell, when it came to Big Match John, it felt like all he ever did after a while was have the same feud over and over again with the appointed villain of any given month. Sure, Cena remained popular with kids who enjoyed his Hulk Hogan-style antics throughout this period, but even for them, the whole thing had a shelf life which was fast approaching its end date, and that made it all the more damaging to the company when one of the more notable attempts to actually build a next generation of stars here flopped so badly. What was this attempt? Well, it was the very quick rise and fall of the Nexus, a group who, as 2010 arrived, enacted a hostile takeover attempt of WWE, much in the same way the NWO had with WCW over a decade prior. Unfortunately though, this angle would not have the same success as the one led by Hollywood Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash back in the day. No, despite there being a lot of promising fresh acts within this group, acts like Wade Barrett, Ryback, and a young Bray Wyatt, it all ended with the group being absolutely buried by the more established names, mainly John Cena himself. And that sent a very clear message to the fans that the old stars were the only ones who could really get over, even if their acts were growing increasingly tired. Hell, even Attitude Era legends who regularly showed up for things like Legends Nights would be routinely put on a higher level than young up-and-coming performers, something which only served to further the belief that the present day had no one that could compare to the older names of the past. That said, there were a couple of performers who did manage to start breaking out at the turn of the decade, with the most notable of these probably being Sheamus, Jeff Hardy, and CM Punk. Yes, by the time the 2000s were over, all three of these men would have reached the mountaintop to become world champion, with this happening with Sheamus after only a few months on the roster. Unfortunately though, in the case of the charismatic Enigma, he'd be gone not long after this, as his continued substance abuse issues meant it was no longer possible for him to represent the WWE product in this current iteration. Sure, he would eventually return to WWE, but by the time he did, the PG era would be long over. And by then, it wasn't like he was being pushed as a major singles act anymore. Still, at least CM Punk, someone who was notoriously drug-free, would stick around, and as the new decade arrived, this would leave him in a prime position to fully ascend to the top of the pack as one of the major players of this PG era. Why was that? Well, the early 2010s would see a lot of big names exit for a variety of different reasons. When, for example, it came to Shawn Michaels, he'd retire from in-ring competition in 2010 after two stellar back-to-back WrestleMania matches with The Undertaker left him nowhere else to go in terms of stealing the show. And elsewhere, when it came to Edge, his career would be cut short the year after that when a severe neck injury meant no doctor would clear him for competition going forward over fears he would end up paralyzed. Then, in Dave Bautista's case, well, Hollywood would be the reason for his exit in 2010, as it would be here that, feeling like he wanted to try going down this path before he got too old, the Animal chose to leave the ring behind and devote his time to movies entirely. Obviously, this worked out very well for him then, as he turned into a huge star and maybe the best wrestler turned actor ever. But that was of little solace to WWE, as they lost out on one of their biggest stars as a result. That said, there was one silver lining to all these high-profile exits, and that silver lining was that it gave space for one of the biggest stars in the company's history to return when, in the lead-up to WrestleMania 27, The Rock made his comeback to the ring after having been gone for 7 years. That's right, this was a pretty huge moment because in the time he'd been away, Dwayne Johnson had gone on to become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. So, as you would expect, his feud with John Cena here was a major one for WWE. Hell, the very fact that it would ultimately span across 3 years, encompass 2 WrestleMania main events, and draw in plenty of other performers into its orbit meant a lot of lapsed fans started to tune in again for the first time in years. Would these lapsed fans stick around after the fact though? Not really. As with the product still feeling stale overall, there was little to entice them to keep watching in the long run. Yes, by the time the new decade was beginning, WWE felt like it was reaching another low ebb creatively, not too dissimilar to the level they'd been reaching during the mid-90s with the New Generation era. The only difference here was that now there was no WCW breathing down their necks in order to push them to get better, and on top of that, there were no Bret Harts or Shawn Michaels on the roster to carry the load in the way that they could even through the darkest times. So low would things get here in terms of the on-screen product. In fact, we'd pretty much revert back to the days of Raw being the only show of note, as it was during the PG era that SmackDown fully fell to the level of becoming a glorified recap show for the Red brand. Needless to say then, this meant the World Heavyweight title massively fell in value, the once mighty prize which had been for so many years associated with the likes of Ric Flair. But then what else was to be expected when this was the time that the belt was being held by the likes of Jack Swagger and the Great Khali? Honestly, it felt like less of a world title and more of a mid-card prize back at the start of the 2010s, and that was reflected in the positioning it got on most shows, with it usually being placed right in the middle of the card. Of course, it wasn't as if the Raw brand and its own world title were always thriving here either. No, there were some pretty big misses on that show too as the new decade dawned. Misses like the infamous anonymous Raw general manager angle, or Michael Cole's WrestleMania feud with Jerry Lawler. But it wasn't like there was no hope for WWE here, because an added consequence of so many big stars like Edge, Batista, Shawn Michaels, and Jeff Hardy leaving was that, as well as The Rock returning, some new acts had to be pushed to the top. Something which would begin the process of freshening things up a little bit, at least, after years of the same people being on top, and any prior attempts at changing this flopping hard like the Nexus had. And there would be no greater example of something new and fresh breaking through during the period than when, in the summer of 2011, CM Punk, a man who had been on the bubble of superstardom up until then, cut his now famous pipe bomb promo. That's right, over the course of one segment, Phil Brooks became the biggest star in the entire industry, as his scathing takedown of WWE as a whole spoke to many fans who'd long since become disenfranchised with the product and felt like the PG era was not what they had initially signed up for. Basically, in that moment, he became to this era what Steve Austin was to the Attitude Era, in that he was someone people could live vicariously through. Really, there were a few weeks there in the summer of 2011 where it felt like WWE might actually be about to undergo something of a renaissance in popularity, as this was arguably the first time they'd caught on to the cultural zeitgeist since the days of Stone Cold. Hell, what they had in CM Punk here was a figure who had the potential to become a generational star for the promotion. And with this being the period where there was a very serious consideration being given to John Cena turning heel in the lead up to his first WrestleMania main event against The Rock at WrestleMania 28, it created a sliding doors moment where 2011 could have been the year we saw Big Match John undergo a Hulk Hogan-esque heel turn, something which would have allowed the Second City Saint to fully ascend to the top of the card as a rattlesnake-style anti-hero for that generation. Sadly though, this was not what happened. No, with Vince McMahon ultimately getting cold feet when it came to turning Cena heel, partially because of how badly business had cratered following Steve Austin's heel turn a decade prior, it meant the champ remained on top of the card. And so when CM Punk finally did win the WWE title for a lengthy period after the summer of Punk had been monumentally botched amidst a sea of Alberto Del Rio cash-ins, Triple H burials, and Kevin Nash texting himself, it left the Chicago native feeling like he was a second fiddle, even if he was supposed to be the guy on top of the card. And this only increased fan frustrations with the product as a while, at least when it came to adult fans anyway. As for the kids, however, well, they still seemed to be largely on board. But even their patience appeared to be waning thin after a while, because it would be around this point that TV ratings really started going into freefall as people tuned out more and more. Still, the money was pouring in anyway, as TV deals remained lucrative and sponsorship opportunities stayed plentiful. So it wasn't like WWE were in danger financially or anything. No, as we said earlier, this was the point they fully became too big to fail in that respect, as they ascended to the level of being a pop culture institution. But even if this was the case, it wasn't as if Vince McMahon was completely resistant to change. No, he understood all too well that fan engagement remained important, and so that was why it would be around here that his stance on certain types of acts started to change. What was this change? Well, after years of the boss only being willing to see one type of performer as capable of being a main event star in WWE, that hardline opinion began to soften. That's right, as the 2010s got going, you no longer had to look like a Sheamus or Alberto Del Rio if you wanted to get a top spot. No, with CM Punk proving that a relatively small guy could get over big time, this meant the door would be open to others like him. And it wouldn't just be smaller guys who this door was suddenly open to either, as the first half of the 2010s would also see a bunch of people who had the label of indie darlings suddenly get opportunities in WWE, with this being a true shocker to anyone who had known what McMahon's take on indie darling had been prior to that. Come on now, back in the 2000s, there would have been no hope of wrestlers like Christopher Daniels, AJ Styles, or Bryan Danielson getting anywhere close to the top of WWE. Hell, there would have been little to no chance they'd ever be employed by Vince McMahon at all. But by the end of 2011, the American Dragon would be in possession of the World Heavyweight title. And this was only the start of his rise as it happened, because over the next few years, his popularity with WWE fans would increase exponentially as that audience became more and more attuned to the style of places like Ring of Honor and New Japan. Sure, like with Punk, Daniel Bryan would have to walk a rocky road in order to get to the top, as at points it felt like Vince McMahon was doing everything he could not to push him. But in the end, he'd be forced to when fan outcry simply got to be too much. And we mean that literally, because it would be in 2013 and 2014 that what was at the time probably the biggest incidence of fan backlash in WWE history took place, when crowds, unhappy over the fact that people like Randy Orton and John Cena were continuing to get pushed as the real top acts over folks like CM Punk and Danielson, began to hijack shows by drowning them out with yes chants. And so we've arrived at the yes movement, the moment the indies fully invaded WWE as Daniel Bryan simply became undeniable. Seriously, there was no one in the entire industry who was more over here. And for a guy who was under 6 feet tall and didn't exactly have a bodybuilder physique, this was quite a change to what had been the norm before for so many years. How would the Yes movement end? Well, at WrestleMania 30, it felt like a new era had finally been reached in full, and the fan voices were heard at last, as it would be here that the American Dragon overcame the villainous Authority who had been holding him down for so many months by beating 3 members of Evolution in one night to become WWE World Heavyweight Champion. And that wasn't the only big moment happening at WrestleMania 30 which signaled that a change was happening. No, there was also the fact that this was the show where The Undertaker's legendary WrestleMania win streak came to an end at 21-1 when Brock Lesnar, someone who had returned to WWE a couple of years prior, did the unthinkable by pinning the dead man clean in the middle of the ring. And as if that weren't enough, WrestleMania 30 would also mark another high point for a group who had by then gone for a year and a half having nothing but peaks, a group known as The Shield. Yes, after making their main roster debut in late 2012, the trio made up of Roman Reigns, Dean Ambrose, and Seth Rollins had completely taken over the main event scene in WWE in short order. Hell, so dominating would they be during their 18-month stretch together, there would be points where it felt like no one could overcome them. Not Kane, not Randy Orton, not even John Cena. Honestly, this was exactly the injection of fresh blood WWE were looking for, as in The Shield, you had 3 young new stars, each of whom had the potential to be the face of the company one day. So by the time it was all over later on in 2014, and they were all embarking in singles runs, they truly felt like top guys. And they weren't the only stable who managed to break out big time during the early to mid 2010s, as elsewhere on the show, the same thing was happening with the Wyatt family. In the case of the Wyatt family, though, there would be one name who was clearly head and shoulders above the rest, and that would be the group's leader, Bray Wyatt, a man who would go on to serve as a dark villainous mirror to Roman Reigns' smiling babyface over the years which followed. Hell, it was the Eater of Worlds who had faced off against John Cena at WrestleMania 30, and while he didn't win here, he would take Big Match John to the edge despite still being a relative rookie. Basically, all of this was to say that things were now changing for WWE big time. Even the women's division was about to enter a new stage, as names like AJ Lee and Paige represented the first embers of the women's revolution which was to come for the main roster. And all the while that was happening, down in Florida, NXT was starting to fully take form as the Super India would become known as during the Black and Gold era. And of course, in what marked maybe the biggest move of all of this would be viewable on Vince McMahon's latest venture, the WWE Network, a dedicated streaming service for the product which changed the game by giving fans access to decades worth of archival content, all for the price of a Netflix subscription. Sure, some things remained the same. After all, you still had names of the past like Brock Lesnar, Triple H, and The Undertaker there, but with each of those names now being part-time, it meant they were no longer the focus of the show. But what of the 2 men widely credited with ushering this new era in? CM Punk and Daniel Bryan. How would they fare in this next phase of WWE's history? Well, for as much as both the Second City Saint and the American Dragon had represented a big change for WWE, they wouldn't be around for long enough to see the result of that change fully take effect. And that was because it had been mere months prior to WrestleMania 30 that Punk had walked out of the company in frustration over the way he was being treated, with this ultimately leading to him into self-imposed exile from the industry for the next 7 years. And then there was Daniel Bryan. Mere months after WrestleMania 30 took place, he would be forced to vacate the WWE title on account of a series of injuries, which ultimately forced him into temporary retirement. Thankfully, however, the door he and Punk had opened was already open enough by then for a whole new generation of young acts to come through, many of whom also had first cut their teeth in places like Ring of Honor and New Japan. But none of this should suggest the PG era was a complete failure or anything. No, while a lot of fans were happy to see it end by the time it did, there were positives which came out of what is still often considered to be WWE's most critically reviled time. After all, it was the time that, with sponsorship opportunities and TV deals reaching their apex, WWE became the company it is today in the sense that it became an undeniable business powerhouse. And even if the creative limitations of the on-screen product left many fans unsatisfied, there were still some hidden gems in there. Hidden gems such as the rise of The Shield, the Yes Movement, and even the CM Punk-Jeff Hardy feud. Then, of course, there was the fact that, with the success of things like Total Divas, whole new demographics were brought on board in the form of young women, so there were reasons to remember this one fondly. That said, even taking these reasons into account, it was clear that come the mid-2010s it was time for a change to be made in the creative direction of the company, even if that creative direction would just mean a difference in the type of wrestlers which were being pushed, and not a complete overhaul of the product as would happen during the early 2020s. Yes, from here on in, the prior holdover generation, most of which came from the Ruthless Aggression era, would finally begin to take a back seat, as Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and more took their rightful place in the spotlight. That's right, in many ways, that future is one we would have never been able to get to were it not for the PG era serving as an oh-so-important bridge, one which may forever go unappreciated but will always have a place in the company's history. The last decade has been an incredibly interesting and often turbulent one for WWE. Yes, we've seen a lot of highs and lows during this time and came out on the other end with a lot of great memories. But how did we get to this point? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. It all goes back to the mid-2010s, as by the time 2014 came around, it was clear that change was needed within the halls of WWE. And the reason for this was because, while the company was rolling in more money than ever and was still a massive success as a result of this, creatively, it had long since grown stagnant. Hell, this was apparent in the fact that, for the most part, the same names had been on top, wrestling each other in the same combinations for years, all via variations of the same basic storylines. And even when a new star did break through like a CM Punk or a Daniel Bryan, they'd always end up playing second fiddle to the likes of John Cena or Brock Lesnar before long, as the status quo inevitably returned. Really, the only people who had truly broken through and remained in a top spot by the time 2014 came around were The Shield. Yes, as the modern era got going post-WrestleMania 30, it was the trio made up of Roman Reigns, Dean Ambrose, and Seth Rollins who were establishing themselves as the new future of the company, and this was only furthered once all three went off in solo directions after the Architect turned on his brothers in June of 2014 to join the Villainous Authority. Obviously then, this helped to re-establish the Authority as the top heel act in all of WWE after Daniel Bryan had briefly gotten the better of them before he was forced onto the injury shelf indefinitely. But it wasn't just The Shield who were being pushed as new major acts as 2014 got going. No, Bray Wyatt would also raise higher up the card here, as post-loss to John Cena at WrestleMania 30, he sought to recover by setting his sights on Chris Jericho. What was happening with the rest of the roster outside these four? Well, the WWE title scene would get a mix-up itself, as once Daniel Bryan was forced to vacate the gold, John Cena would score his 15th world title win. But he wouldn't be holding on to the gold for long here. No, fresh off of ending The Undertaker's undefeated streak at the Showcase of the Immortals earlier on that year, and shocking the world in the process, Brock Lesnar would absolutely annihilate Big Match John in one of the most one-sided squashes ever at SummerSlam, so as to take the gold home for himself. So began a story that would carry on all the way up until WrestleMania 31. Who could slay the Beast and bring the title home? And while there were plenty of potential babyface options for this, it didn't take long for it to become apparent that WWE planned for it to be Roman Reigns who would serve as the company's savior here, and from there go on to become the successor to John Cena as the next top babyface in WWE. The only problem with this plan though was that back in 2014, the big dog was still green as grass, barely beyond rookie level as far as being a main eventer was concerned, with him hardly having any singles bouts on the main roster yet. And fans could see right through these limitations, as well as WWE's attempts to shove him down their throats whether they wanted him or not. What did this lead to? Well, a strong sense of resentment building amongst the audience was the major consequence, with this being not too dissimilar to how they'd felt when Daniel Bryan was being buried prior to WrestleMania 30. That's right, there was just no way the fans were going to take to Roman as a top guy here, not yet at least. So when he won the 2015 Royal Rumble and booked his ticket into the main event of WrestleMania 31 ahead of people like Dean Ambrose and the recently injury-free Daniel Bryan, it led to the future Tribal Chief getting aggressively booed out of the building. Obviously then, this created a major problem as WWE didn't want their biggest show of the year having its main event hijacked with boos for the supposed top face, especially not when it was hoped that the addition of Sting in his lone WrestleMania match would draw in a lot of lapsed fans once more. And thankfully, Vince McMahon would realize that too, because prior to the event, he finally decided he couldn't put Roman over at WrestleMania anymore, not with these kinds of reactions. So instead, he went for option B, with this option being for Seth Rollins to cash in the Money in the Bank contract he'd won earlier on in 2014 during the main event that night between the Big Dog and Brock Lesnar, and in the process, steal the title away for himself. And so, like that then, the modern era was fully solidified as Seth became the first NXT graduate to hold the top prize on the main roster. But he wouldn't be the last, because by 2015, NXT was already making a name for itself as the hottest brand in all of North American wrestling, with its takeover shows regularly outshining main roster offerings. What made it so great? Well, it being booked by Triple H instead of Vince McMahon, it offered something fresh and different for WWE fans, something which was a lot closer in style to an old territory, with simple booking designed to build up big cards filled with excellent matches. Obviously then, in order to maintain this level of greatness, a lot of new high-level wrestlers were constantly having to be brought in to replace the old ones who were being called up to the main roster. And some of the biggest and best of these, at least as far as the men's division was concerned, were people like Kevin Owens, Finn Balor, Samoa Joe, Shinsuke Nakamura, and the man who served as the heart and soul of the brand for so long, Sami Zayn. And they weren't the only ones making NXT the hottest thing in North American wrestling back in the mid-2010s. No, it would also be here that WWE's women's revolution fully got going, as it was then that the Four Horsewomen first rose to prominence, a quartet of performers made up of Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley. Yes, within this group you had a nucleus of something special, something which would take the developmental brand to heights that, in the opinion of many fans back then, were far higher than that of the main roster. And as if that wasn't enough, additional high-level female workers would be brought in to further raise the game later on down the line too, in the form of excellent Joshi talent like Asuka, Io Shirai, and Kairi Sane. That's right, NXT was truly booming back then, with it serving as the cool WWE brand to watch. And the comparisons which inevitably got made between it and the main roster were not favorable to Raw and SmackDown for the most part. No, while the WWE title reign of Seth Rollins had been well received, and while the addition of some new stars to the mix had helped to freshen things up a little, the overall direction of both Raw and SmackDown was still getting a lot of criticism. Sure, there were some causes for hope, mostly from the likes of recent NXT graduates, but the actual storylines they were being given to work with here often felt nonsensical and scrambled together at the last minute. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to hear stories around this time of Raw's script still being written as the show was going to air, or for entire angles to be dropped on a whim if Vince McMahon took a sudden dislike to them. Really, there were points where it felt like the only person who was being given any real focus at all in WWE was Roman Reigns. And this would only increase the fan rejection of him, particularly when, at the Survivor Series later that year, he finally won the world title for the first time following the Architect vacating the belt as a result of injury. Where would things go from here? Well, it would only get worse for the Big Dog, unfortunately, because despite there being a brief couple of months towards the end of 2015 where it felt like things had finally turned a corner with him, come the 2016 Royal Rumble, Roman would be getting booed all over again. And all of this would lead to a situation where WrestleMania 32 in the spring of that year ended up serving as a stark portrait of where the company was by the mid-2010s in terms of fan perception. Why was this? Well, despite it legitimately having the biggest attendance in wrestling history, if we don't count those Collision in Korea shows from WCW back in the day, it was not critically well received, with much of the ire being saved for Shane McMahon getting used for an Undertaker match, Bray Wyatt being jobbed out for a Rock segment, and the main event turning fans off as it once again saw the company try to force a square peg into a round hole by having Roman Reigns regain the WWE title from Triple H. Yes, WWE continued to draw boatloads of money here, that much was undeniable. But fans continued to be dissatisfied with what they were seeing on the main roster, and this meant there were more than a few worried faces within the halls of WWE as they understood that something was going to have to give eventually. What was the solution to this problem? Well, it seemed clear to everyone watching: pump the brakes on the Big Dog for a while, and instead go with either Dean Ambrose or Daniel Bryan as the ace now that John Cena was entering part-time status. Sadly though, this was not what WWE wanted to do. But then, in the case of the American Dragon, it's not like they had much choice in the matter, as it would be around this time that he'd have to enter temporary retirement after a series of head injuries left him in pretty bad shape. Still, there was no reason they couldn't have gone with the lunatic fringe on top, and thankfully this would eventually happen, even if it was mostly a result of a new top babyface having to be crowned quickly after the big dog got suspended over a wellness policy violation in the summer of 2016. But however it came about, the end result was the same. And now that Ambrose was the man, all while John Cena was moving down to the mid-card in order to have his excellent United States title run, it felt like some positive changes were finally being made. This didn't last for long though, because never fully understanding the appeal of Jon Moxley as a crazy man anti-hero, Vince McMahon ended up booking him pretty poorly during his title run. And that all led to the whole thing being a bit of a flop. And this wasn't the only major issue WWE had in mid-2016, as, on a larger business scale, there was also a sense that, despite them having two major main roster shows every week, the nature of SmackDown basically having been relegated to being a recap show for Raw meant there was no reason to watch more than one. How would this latter problem be solved? Well, that would be by bringing back the brand split, a move which would once again separate Raw and SmackDown into two separate rosters with two separate sets of belts for each to fight over. And luckily, this brand split would prove to be a success in terms of bringing ratings back up a little bit, especially when it came to Friday nights. That's right, just like with the first roster split back during the early 2000s, it was SmackDown which really came out the winner here, as it was the one which felt the most rejuvenated by the entire situation. Honestly, prior to the creative turnaround which began in 2022, this spell for the blue brand was, as far as many fans were concerned, by far and away the best the main roster had been in years. With Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan steering the ship in kayfabe, it turned into the land of opportunity, a place where the likes of Becky Lynch, Alexa Bliss, and AJ Styles could all rise to the level of superstardom. Of course, that's not to say there was nothing worthwhile happening on Raw here though. It's just that even if they did have their own success stories and people like Kevin Owens, Sasha Banks, and Finn Balor, they were still being dragged down overall by the fact that Roman Reigns continued to be pushed as the guy, in spite of fans loudly telling the company they didn't want him in this spot. What was going on with NXT while all that was happening? Well, as usual, they continued to deliver. Hell, it was during this period that the brand arguably reached its high watermark with not just the resurgence of tag team wrestling in WWE, a resurgence led by duos like American Alpha and The Revival, but also the addition of NXT UK, a satellite branch of the developmental brand which first introduced WWE audiences to performers such as Gunther, Toni Storm, and Rhea Ripley. And then of course there was what many people to this day still consider to be the high watermark of the black and gold brand, the feud between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, which began in 2017 and went on for well over a year before finally reaching its climax towards the end of the decade. All of this is to say then, even if you weren't happy with the main roster product, there was always something worth watching on the developmental brand. With this becoming such a popular opinion by that point, NXT were actually starting to fill large arenas for their takeover shows. It's just a shame the same couldn't be said for the main roster, as despite SmackDown still having a lot of ups, and even with Raw having highlights like the Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens bromance, attendance at shows was dropping to sometimes scary levels as fans just couldn't find the motivation to attend in person. And while this clearly wasn't all his fault, a lot of the blame for that was put on the shoulders of Roman Reigns, as he was supposed to be the man leading the charge for this new generation. What he really needed then was freshening up, maybe being taken off of TV for a while so that fans could miss him. What no one expected though was that when this did actually happen, it would be done for the reason it was. Yes, it was in the autumn of 2018 that the big dog was pulled from TV indefinitely when he found out that he had a recurrence of the same cancer which had dogged him back when he was in his 20s. Obviously then, this meant Vince McMahon was going to be left with no choice but to find someone else to push in Reigns' place while he was gone and battling for his life. And while many wondered if it might end up being one of his former stablemates in Dean Ambrose or Seth Rollins who got that push, or maybe even someone else like Bray Wyatt, someone who was by then on the verge of reinventing himself as the Nightmarish Fiend, it wouldn't be any of those performers who got the nod for the spot of interim ace. Rather, it would be a woman named Becky Lynch. That's right, after transforming into the Man in mid-2018, Lynch would undergo a meteoric rise in popularity akin to that of Steve Austin in 1997. With this eventually leading to her becoming the first female to ever serve as the top star of a major wrestling promotion. And that would all end with her main eventing WrestleMania 35 against both Charlotte Flair and former UFC bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey, with both the Raw and SmackDown women's titles on the line. Truly then, this was a historic moment. But it wasn't the only historic moment which took place on that show, as earlier on the same night, Kofi Kingston would become the first African-born star to win the WWE title after he reached the climax of his own meteoric rise, one which had by that point come to be known as Kofi Mania. Did the success of those two angles signify that the WWE main roster had finally turned things around? Well, not exactly, as while Becky Lynch would remain a top star going forward, Kofi would be back in the mid-card by the autumn as Roman Reigns returned from his health scare in order to reassert his spot at the peak of the card. And sure, fans weren't exactly booing the big dog anymore after what he'd just gone through, but they weren't exactly cheering him either, making the whole thing feel pretty weak in terms of energy and excitement whenever he was on screen. Then, of course, there was the botching of The Fiend, combined with the pushing of acts like Baron Corbin and Lacey Evans, which only served to turn fans off all the more. And that's why this was the worst possible timing as far as Vince McMahon was concerned for a new competitor to rise up, a competitor which went by the name of All Elite Wrestling. Yes, by the autumn of 2019, AEW had begun airing their weekly flagship show, Dynamite, and this left WWE looking to counter them. What would Vince McMahon do to try and stop his new competition in their tracks before they could fully get established? Well, he'd have NXT go head-to-head with them every week in what would become known as the Wednesday Night Wars. Unfortunately, though, NXT didn't beat AEW during those early years, as the latter had names like Kenny Omega, Chris Jericho, and Jon Moxley, with the latter two having jumped from WWE in order to be a part of this new promotion. And that wasn't the only problem WWE was going through here, as it was in early 2020 that the world went into lockdown, and all of a sudden, no fans were allowed in attendance at shows for the foreseeable future, with this meaning that during those early weeks after things closed down, Raw, SmackDown, and NXT all took place in front of an empty performance center. Hell, even WrestleMania 36 would be forced to take place in the same desolate warehouse, making the whole thing feel about as far away from being the biggest show of the year as it could be. Sure, eventually Vince McMahon would bring in the Thunderdome to try and add some sense of atmosphere to the shows, but throughout 2020, it felt like WWE was fast losing any sense of momentum they had initially gained when SmackDown had moved to Fox. That said, it wasn't like it was all bad news for WWE here, because it had been in 2020 that, after taking a sabbatical from the ring in order to look after his health, Roman Reigns had returned. And this time, he had not returned as the same old tired babyface he'd been before. No, now the big dog had transformed into the tribal chief, a mob boss-like megalomaniacal heel who ruled his family with an iron fist. Yes, this was the birth of the Bloodline, the angle which, come 2021, was the hottest thing in all of WWE, and was the thing threatening to cause Vince McMahon's promotion to shift the pendulum of momentum back in their direction again. Of course, while it would do this eventually, Vince McMahon wouldn't be there to enjoy it. Why was that? Well, it was in the summer of 2022 that the foundations of WWE were rocked to the core when the boss would leave the company for the first time in light of the scandal and subsequent lawsuit he was involved in. So now, with McMahon gone as head of creative, it was left to Triple H to take over the reins. And this proved to be exactly the fresh eyes the main roster had needed for all these years, as with the game now in charge, not only did the Bloodline go to another level with the new addition of Sami Zayn, but a whole new generation of stars could reach the top of the card and become major players. We're talking about acts like Rhea Ripley, Dominic Mysterio, and Gunther here. And then of course there was Cody Rhodes, someone who had made the jump back over to WWE from AEW at WrestleMania 39. All of these elements combined helped to rocket the promotion towards new levels of success they hadn't seen since the early 2000s. Yes, this was nothing less than a modern renaissance for the WWE product, and that renaissance would be solidified when, in the midst of weekly sellout crowds attending shows and rising TV ratings, Ari Emanuel and his Endeavor Group purchased the company and added it to their TKO brand alongside UFC. All well, at around the same point in time, Vince McMahon would leave once and for all. What was happening with NXT while all that was going on? Well, with the brand by then having moved away from the black and gold era into the 2.0 one, there would be some early growing pains. But after a while, the now Shawn Michaels-led show would settle into a groove of its own as it helped to build up new stars like Braun Breaker, Tiffany Stratton, and Roxanne Perez. Of course, the real success story, however, remained the main roster, especially in the lead up to WrestleMania 40. Why was that? Well, this show in many ways would represent the high watermark of WWE's modern hot streak, as it would be here that with The Rock coming back into the fold to act as both a real-life member of the TKO board and the villainous on-screen final boss character, he would stand in the corner of his cousin Roman Reigns as they attempted to stop Cody Rhodes from finishing the story and becoming WWE Champion. Would the full might of the Bloodline be able to stop Cody Rhodes from winning the gold here? No, it wouldn't be, as after failing to get the job done the year prior, WrestleMania 40 was the moment that the American Nightmare finally did it, and in doing so, it felt like he'd helped the WWE truly reach the top of the world again. Hell, for the rest of the year which followed, they'd continue to be on fire business-wise, with arenas usually selling out very quickly and the product continuing to branch out its pay-per-view schedule around the world to places as far and wide as Australia, France, Puerto Rico, and the UK. Of course, it wasn't just Cody and the Bloodline angle that were making WWE so hot here, though. No, aside from some of the other recently elevated names like Rhea Ripley and Gunther that we mentioned a moment ago, there was also the continued excellent work of people like Seth Rollins, Sami Zayn, and Becky Lynch, as well as the full elevation of acts such as Jey Uso, Damian Priest, and Io Sky to thank for this. And as if that wasn't enough, there was also the reintroduction of CM Punk to the roster, a move which many would have seen as being unthinkable only a year or so prior. Really, for the first time in a long time, it felt like everything was firing on all cylinders as, with the new management in charge, locker room morale was high and everyone seemed to be working on the same page. And on top of this, WWE would continue to push into further business opportunities, with all this reaching another apex in January of 2025 with the debut of Raw on Netflix. Obviously then this was a major deal, as with Netflix being the biggest streaming service in the world, it suddenly made WWE available to a lot more people around the planet. And while this would not lead to a full boom period as had happened in the 80s and late 90s, it would still increase the footprint of the company Vince McMahon Sr. had started all those years ago by tenfold. Then of course, even further inroads would be made in increasing that footprint later on in 2025, at least in terms of the North American market, with the debut of WWE on ESPN. Where has all this left WWE as things stand today? It remains as strong as ever, if not stronger. And it's not going away anytime soon, as WWE are preparing for the future. That's right, with Triple H continuing to be at the helm, and now very much positioning himself as the Dana White of WWE, we're beginning to see the rise of a whole new generation of stars like Braun Breaker, Jacob Fatu, Stephanie Vaquer, and Lyra Valkyria, just to name a few. Hell, even NXT, a brand which felt like it was struggling at one point after it initially transformed into its 2.0 incarnation, has been able to successfully build itself back up to the point that it's now involved in invasion angles of its own with the likes of TNA, all while it's building up the generation after the next, the generation which involves the likes of Ricky Saints, Javon Evans, Oba Femi, and Sol Ruka. Will this all lead to an entirely new era being born soon? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. But if something new does take the place of this modern era soon, it'll be building itself on the shoulders of a truly transformative time for WWE. Because over the years, we've seen it go from the depths of creative stagnation all the way to incredible heights with the likes of Cody Rhodes and the Bloodline leading the way. That's right, there's no telling what WWE will look like in 5 years. And that means we're all going to have to watch intently to see how things shake out. Of course, all the while we do, we'll be making sure to remember the events of the modern era which made it all possible by in many ways serving as the most important era in the company's entire history.